Forbidden archives revealed a whispering map beneath Prague, where vanished scientists encoded humanity's final warning. Each symbol predicted disasters before they happened. Yesterday, investigators unlocked the last chamber and discovered fresh footprints, candles, and a recording repeating sentence. They returned. At the edge of a windswept plain in northern Afghanistan, where the Oxus River once carried merchants, soldiers, and philosophers between worlds, the ruins of Ai-Khanoum rest beneath layers of dust and silence. Broken columns lie scattered across the earth. Faded courtyards open into emptiness. Fragments of Greek inscriptions still cling to stone walls weathered by centuries of heat, invasion, and abandonment. To modern archaeologists, Ai-Khanoum was one of the most extraordinary discoveries of the 20th century, a Greek city built thousands of miles from Athens, standing at the crossroads of Central Asia. Yet despite its wealth, influence, and strategic importance, the city vanished with startling suddenness. Its fall remains one of the ancient world's quietest and most haunting disappearances. Founded sometime after the conquests of Alexander the Great in the late 4th century BC, Ai-Khanoum emerged as a distant outpost of Hellenistic civilization. Located near the borders of modern Afghanistan and Tajikistan, the city blended Greek architecture with Eastern traditions. Excavations revealed theaters, gymnasiums, temples, and elegant villas decorated with Corinthian columns. Greek philosophical maxims were carved into stone. Coins minted in the city traveled across Asia. For a time, Ai-Khanoum appeared to flourish beyond expectation, but the city's location may also have sealed its fate. Perched along critical trade routes, Ai-Khanoum occupied a vulnerable frontier between competing kingdoms and migrating tribes. Historians believe the city became part of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, a powerful but fragile realm isolated from the Mediterranean heart of Greek culture. Surrounded by deserts, mountains, and rival empires, the kingdom faced constant pressure from both internal conflict and external invasion. Then, sometime around 145 BC, the city fell. Archaeological evidence suggests destruction was swift and violent. Burned buildings, collapsed defenses, and abandoned possessions hint at chaos erupting within the streets. Some researchers point to nomadic invasions from Central Asian tribes, possibly the Yuezhi or the Saka peoples, as the most likely explanation. Ancient writers described waves of migrations destabilizing entire kingdoms across the region during this period. Yet, Ai-Khanoum's destruction raises difficult questions. Why did such a wealthy city fail to recover? Why was it abandoned so completely? Other ancient cities survived invasions, rebuilt their walls, and adapted to new rulers. Ai-Khanoum, however, seemed to disappear almost entirely from memory. There are stranger details as well. Among the ruins, archaeologists uncovered signs that some sections of the city may have remained occupied briefly after the destruction. Certain rooms appeared hastily reused. Makeshift fires were lit inside once grand buildings, but whoever remained did not stay long. It was as though survivors lingered in the shadow of catastrophe before finally walking away forever. Some historians believe economic collapse played a larger role than invasion alone. Trade networks may have shifted. Political authority may have fractured beyond repair. Isolated from allies and surrounded by instability, the city may simply have become impossible to defend or sustain. Others look toward environmental explanations. The Oxus River has changed course multiple times throughout history. Did water shortages slowly weaken the city before the final attack came? Could drought or agricultural decline have left Ai-Khanoum vulnerable from within long before enemies appeared at its gates? And then there are the more speculative theories. A few researchers have wondered whether the city concealed something politically dangerous, perhaps hidden conflicts between Greek elites and local populations, tensions erased from surviving historical records. Some point to the unusual absence of detailed ancient accounts describing the city's final days. Others speculate about forgotten religious disputes, secret factions, or treasures removed before the collapse. Legends in nearby regions speak of cursed cities swallowed by war and silence. Though there is no evidence linking such stories directly to Ai-Khanoum, the atmosphere surrounding the ruins invites imagination. Standing among the broken columns today, it is difficult not to wonder what final scenes unfolded there beneath the smoke of destruction. Did the inhabitants know the end was coming? Did caravans arrive carrying rumors of approaching armies? Were the city's libraries emptied in haste? Or did ordinary life continue until the final moment, interrupted suddenly by forces no one could stop? The deeper archaeologists dig into Ai-Khanoum, the more fragments emerge, but not necessarily answers. Each discovery illuminates part of the city's story, while deepening the shadows around its disappearance. Beneath the ruined foundations may still lie records, artifacts, or clues capable of reshaping what we know about one of history's most isolated Greek cities. For now, Ai-Khanoum remains suspended between history and mystery, a forgotten frontier where civilizations met, flourished briefly, and then vanished into silence, leaving only ruins beneath the Afghan wind. And perhaps that is what makes lost cities so compelling. Even in ruin, places like Ai-Khanoum leave behind traces, columns, coins, fragments of walls, that allow historians to reconstruct at least part of their story. But some disappearances leave behind almost nothing at all. No surviving libraries, no royal archives, only whispers scattered across deserts once crossed by forgotten caravans. Far to the west of Ai-Khanoum, beyond the mountains and trade roads of Central Asia, another mystery emerged from the ancient world of merchants and empires. In the heart of the Syrian desert stood Palmyra, an oasis city surrounded by endless waves of sand and stone. By day, the ruins shimmer beneath harsh sunlight. By night, the desert becomes silent, except for the wind moving through broken archways and abandoned temples. For centuries, Palmyra served as one of the ancient world's greatest crossroads. Roman officials, Arab tribes, Persian envoys, and traders from India and China all passed through its markets. Camel caravans carried silk, spices, ivory, glass, and precious manuscripts across impossible distances. Wealth flowed into the city, transforming it into a powerful commercial empire suspended between East and West. And where wealth and trade flourish, knowledge often follows. Historians know the merchants of Palmyra were unusually sophisticated for their time. Inscriptions discovered throughout the city reveal multilingual communities speaking Aramaic, Greek, Latin, and other regional languages. Contracts were recorded meticulously. Trade routes were mapped carefully. Religious customs from distant cultures blended together inside the city's temples and shrines. Yet beneath this thriving network lies a strange historical absence. Despite Palmyra's enormous importance, very few merchant records or literary archives have survived. Scholars have long wondered how such a wealthy and connected civilization could leave behind so little written material compared to other major trade centers of the ancient world. Some believe the explanation is simple. Ancient documents were fragile. Papyrus decayed. Wars destroyed archives. Fires consumed libraries. Over centuries, invading armies repeatedly swept through the region. The city itself suffered devastating destruction during the Roman reconquest after the rebellion of Queen Zenobia in the 3rd century AD. But other researchers suspect something more unusual may have occurred. Ancient references hint that Palmyrene merchants maintained private collections of records far beyond the city itself. Caravan leaders crossing the Syrian desert reportedly stored contracts, maps, and correspondence in remote desert stations, hidden repositories positioned along trade routes stretching toward Mesopotamia, Arabia, and beyond. If true, These desert libraries may still exist somewhere beneath the sands. The theory is not entirely without foundation. Archaeologists have uncovered isolated caravan outposts scattered across the desert, some containing fragments of texts and storage chambers built deep within stone foundations. A few discoveries suggest merchants took extraordinary measures to protect commercial knowledge. In an age where trade routes meant power, information itself may have been one of the empire's most valuable commodities. And then there are the accounts that continue to puzzle historians. Several medieval Arab chroniclers described rumors of sealed chambers hidden beneath abandoned desert forts, rooms containing scrolls untouched for centuries. One traveler wrote of a collapsed structure where locals claimed books of the ancients had once been buried to protect them from invading armies. Another account spoke of merchants who vanished during sandstorms while transporting records of kingdoms and stars. Most historians approach such stories cautiously. Oral traditions evolve over time, often blending memory with myth. Yet the sheer scale of Palmyra's trade network raises difficult questions. How did merchants coordinate journeys spanning thousands of miles without extensive archives? Where were shipping records kept? Where were financial agreements stored? Some researchers believe vast quantities of written materials simply remain undiscovered beneath the desert itself. Satellite imaging has revealed buried structures surrounding ancient caravan routes, many still unexplored due to political instability and harsh terrain. Entire settlements may remain hidden beneath drifting sand dunes. If archives were intentionally concealed during periods of war or collapse, they could survive in sealed underground chambers even now. More speculative theories go further. A few writers have suggested the missing libraries contained knowledge considered dangerous or politically sensitive. Secret trade alliances, astronomical observations, or religious texts blending Eastern and Western traditions. Others wonder whether powerful merchant families deliberately erased records to protect hidden wealth or escape imperial taxation. There is no direct evidence supporting such claims. Yet the mystery deepens precisely because the silence feels incomplete. In a city once filled with traders documenting every movement of gold, silk, and incense, why do so few records remain? Why do fragments appear scattered across deserts, while the larger archive seems absent from history entirely? Perhaps the answer still lies buried somewhere beyond the ruins of Palmyra, beneath dunes reshaped endlessly by the desert wind. A collapsed chamber, a forgotten caravan station, shelves of manuscripts sealed away during an ancient crisis and never recovered. Or perhaps the libraries disappeared long ago, carried into dust alongside the civilization that created them. For now, the desert keeps its silence, and the missing archives of the Palmyrene merchants remain suspended between history, rumor, and the possibility that entire chapters of the ancient world are still waiting to be uncovered beneath the sands. If the sands surrounding Palmyra have concealed forgotten libraries for centuries, then history may not only vanish beneath deserts. Sometimes it disappears from the centers of power themselves, inside royal palaces, behind marble walls, within archives believed too important to ever be lost. High above the valleys of western Anatolia, on a steep hill overlooking the modern Turkish city of Pergamon, the ruins of ancient Pergamon still dominate the landscape. Broken temples rise from the stone terraces. The remains of theaters cling dramatically to the mountainside. Wind moves through collapsed colonnades where kings, scholars, and priests once walked beneath banners of empire. In antiquity, Pergamon was more than a city. It was a center of political influence, intellectual ambition, and royal prestige. During the Hellenistic Age, especially under the Attalid dynasty in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, Pergamon became one of the Mediterranean world's greatest capitals. Wealth poured into the kingdom through military alliances, trade, and cultural patronage. Monumental architecture transformed the hilltop into a symbol of power, visible for miles across the surrounding plains. But perhaps the city's most famous treasure was not its temples or palaces. It was its knowledge. Ancient sources describe the Library of Pergamon as one of the largest collections of written works in the ancient world, rivaled only by the legendary Library of Alexandria. According to historical accounts, hundreds of thousands of scrolls may once have filled its halls. Scholars traveled from distant regions to study there. Philosophers debated beneath painted ceilings while royal archivists copied texts by hand onto carefully prepared parchment, a material some traditions claim was perfected in Pergamon itself. And yet, despite the city's enormous historical importance, much of Pergamon's written legacy has vanished. The loss extends beyond literature alone. Historians remain deeply puzzled by the disappearance of the kingdom's royal archives. Administrative records, diplomatic correspondence, military reports, financial accounts, and internal communications that should have documented the workings of one of the ancient world's most influential states. Where did these archives go? The mainstream explanation is, at first glance, straightforward. Ancient libraries were vulnerable. Fire, war, humidity, decay, and political upheaval destroyed countless documents throughout antiquity. Pergamon eventually came under Roman control after the death of King Attalus III in 133 BC, when the kingdom was reportedly bequeathed to Rome. Over the following centuries, earthquakes, invasions, and urban decline reshaped the city repeatedly. Some ancient writers even claimed that large portions of Pergamon's library were transferred elsewhere. One famous tradition suggests Mark Antony later gifted many Pergamene scrolls to Cleopatra for the Library of Alexandria. Historians continue debating how much truth lies behind this story, but if major collections were removed, what became of the records left behind? Because strangely, almost no trace of the Royal Administrative Archives has ever been recovered. This absence has led some researchers to wonder whether the archives were intentionally relocated or concealed. Archaeological excavations have revealed extensive underground structures beneath parts of Pergamon's Acropolis, storage chambers, tunnels, vaults, and hidden foundations whose purposes remain uncertain. Some experts believe many sections of the ancient city remain unexplored beneath later construction and collapsed debris. Could sealed archive rooms still exist beneath the hill? The possibility is not impossible. In other parts of the ancient world, hidden caches of documents have survived unexpectedly for thousands of years. Clay tablets preserved in desert climates, scrolls protected within sealed jars, administrative records forgotten inside buried palaces. Pergamon presents a more difficult environment, but the scale of the missing material continues to intrigue historians. And then there are the stranger theories. Some speculate the archives may have contained politically dangerous information regarding Rome's expansion into the eastern Mediterranean. Pergamon occupied a delicate position between rising imperial powers, shifting alliances, and regional rivalries. Did certain records disappear because they revealed uncomfortable truths about diplomacy, succession disputes, or secret negotiations? Others point toward the kingdom's religious significance. Pergamon was home to major cult centers, including sanctuaries connected to healing rituals and mystery traditions. A few fringe theories suggest the archives included esoteric writings never intended for public circulation. Texts blending science, ritual, astronomy, and royal authority. There is no verified evidence supporting such claims. Yet the mystery persists partly because the historical silence feels disproportionate. For a kingdom so advanced administratively, why are surviving internal records so scarce? Even ancient historians seemed aware that something had been lost. Fragments of later Roman writings reference Pergamene documents no longer known today. Certain events involving the Attalid kings appear only partially preserved, as though sections of the historical record vanished between generations of copying and transmission. Standing among the ruins now, overlooking valleys that once connected Pergamon to the wider ancient world, it becomes easier to understand why the mystery endures. Beneath layers of collapsed stone may still lie unopened chambers, hidden repositories, or fragments of forgotten correspondence capable of reshaping what we know about the Hellenistic world. Or perhaps the archives disappeared long ago, not through dramatic destruction, but through the slower erosion of memory itself. For now, Pergamon remains suspended between archaeology and absence, a city celebrated for preserving knowledge, while some of its most important secrets may still remain buried beneath the hill where kings once ruled above the clouds. Perhaps that is the deeper pattern connecting so many ancient mysteries. Lost archives, buried libraries, vanished records, all suggest that history is shaped not only by what survives, but by what disappears. Sometimes the missing pieces are hidden beneath ruined cities. Sometimes they lie beneath mountains long associated with sacred memory and ritual. In the northern highlands of the West Bank in Palestine, Mount Ebal rises above the surrounding valleys in stark, rocky silence. The slopes are harsh and uneven, covered with pale stone and sparse vegetation shaped by centuries of wind and sun. From the summit, the landscape stretches outward across ancient trade paths and settlements that have witnessed thousands of years of conflict, migration, worship, and survival. For generations, Mount Ebal has carried deep religious and historical significance. Ancient traditions connected the mountain with ceremonies of covenant, blessing, judgment, and sacrifice. References to the mountain appear in early biblical texts, placing it within some of the oldest remembered sacred narratives of the region. But it is not the mountain itself that has drawn the most intense debate among archaeologists and historians. It is what may lie beneath it. In the 1980s, excavations on Mount Ebal uncovered a large stone structure unlike anything easily classified. The site consisted of massive walls, layered construction phases, ash deposits, animal bones, and what appeared to be a raised installation or platform. Some archaeologists proposed that the structure may have functioned as an early ritual altar dating to the Iron Age, possibly around the 13th or 12th century BC. The claim immediately became controversial. Supporters argued that several details aligned with descriptions of ancient sacrificial practices, the absence of pig bones, the arrangement of stones, and evidence of repeated burning rituals. Critics responded that the structure could just as easily represent a watchtower, farmhouse, military outpost, or communal installation later interpreted through religious assumptions. Decades later, the debate remains unresolved. Yet beyond the visible ruins, another mystery slowly emerged. Ground surveys and later examinations suggested the possibility of hidden voids, subsurface walls, or sealed areas beneath portions of the structure. Some researchers proposed that earlier construction phases might still exist below the visible remains, possibly chambers intentionally filled or buried during later ritual activity. What purpose would such chambers have served? The mainstream archaeological explanation is cautious. Ancient ritual sites often underwent multiple stages of rebuilding. Earlier foundations were commonly buried beneath later constructions as sacred spaces evolved over generations. Hidden chambers may simply reflect ordinary architectural development, storage areas, or structural reinforcement. But Mount Ebal's unusual reputation has encouraged more speculative interpretations as well. Certain scholars and independent researchers have wondered whether the underground spaces were connected to restricted ceremonies conducted away from public view. In many ancient cultures, sacred rituals were divided between public observance and hidden initiation rites, known only to select groups. Could Mount Ebal have functioned in a similar way? Others focus on the mountain's symbolic importance in ancient tradition. If sacred covenants or ceremonial declarations were believed to occur there, might records, offerings, or ritual objects have been concealed beneath the site intentionally? Fragments of burned material recovered during excavations have only deepened the intrigue. Ash layers containing carefully selected animal remains suggest repeated ceremonial activity over long periods of time. Yet the full meaning of these rituals remains uncertain. Were they part of a centralized religious system? Local tribal ceremonies? Transitional practices blending older traditions with emerging beliefs? The deeper researchers investigate, the more complex the picture becomes. And then there are the claims that move further beyond conventional archaeology. A handful of fringe theories propose that sealed chambers beneath Mount Ebal may still contain untouched artifacts or inscriptions capable of reshaping understanding of early religious history in the region. Some point to ancient traditions involving hidden sacred objects placed beneath altars or within foundation deposits. Others speculate about concealed passages, forgotten priestly chambers, or relics deliberately buried during periods of conflict and upheaval. There is no verified evidence confirming such ideas. Many archaeologists remain skeptical that large unexplored chambers even exist beneath the structure at all. Geological irregularities, collapsed spaces, and natural voids can easily create misleading survey results. Yet uncertainty continues to surround the site. Part of the mystery comes from the mountain itself. Mount Ebal feels isolated even today, its rocky silence creating an atmosphere where ancient ritual does not seem entirely distant. Standing among the stones, surrounded by winds moving across the highlands, it becomes easier to imagine ceremonies unfolding there thousands of years ago beneath torchlight and smoke. What exactly took place on the mountain? Why was the structure buried and rebuilt? And if hidden chambers do exist beneath the visible ruins, what purpose did they truly serve? For now, the answers remain incomplete. Beneath the layers of stone and ash, Mount Ebal continues to guard its secrets carefully, leaving historians, archaeologists, and observers suspended between evidence, tradition, and the possibility that something still waits undiscovered beneath the sacred mountain. If Mount Ebal leaves historians searching beneath layers of stone for traces of forgotten ritual, then another ancient site raises an even more unsettling question. What happens when the dead themselves become part of the mystery? Along the cliffs above the Euphrates River in eastern Syria, the ruins of Dura-Europos overlook a dry and silent landscape shaped by centuries of erosion. The city's crumbling walls stand exposed against the desert horizon, their outlines barely visible beneath drifting sand and collapsed earth. Once, this was one of the most strategically important frontier cities of the ancient world, a fortified settlement suspended between powerful empires. Today, it feels abandoned in a deeper sense, as though something within the ruins was interrupted suddenly and never fully explained. Founded during the Hellenistic period after the campaigns of Alexander the Great, Dura-Europos evolved into a remarkable cultural crossroads. Greek, Roman, Persian, Semitic, and local traditions blended together within its streets. Temples dedicated to different faiths stood side by side. Military garrisons occupied fortified towers overlooking trade routes stretching across Mesopotamia. But the city's final chapter was violent. In the 3rd century AD, Dura-Europos came under siege during the expanding conflict between the Roman Empire and the Sasanian Persians. Archaeological evidence suggests the city fell sometime around AD 256 after intense fighting along its western defensive walls. It was during excavations of those fortifications that archaeologists uncovered one of the site's most disturbing discoveries. Buried deep within collapsed tunnels and defensive embankments were human bodies, many of them still positioned where they had died nearly 18 centuries earlier. Some skeletons appeared tangled together in narrow underground passages. Others were found near siege tunnels carved beneath the city walls. Weapons, armor fragments, and traces of burned material surrounded the remains. At first glance, the explanation seemed straightforward. soldiers killed during desperate underground combat. But as researchers studied the scene more carefully, strange details began to emerge. Several bodies appeared to have died suddenly without obvious traumatic injuries. Some were found in positions suggesting panic or collapse rather than direct combat. The tunnels themselves showed evidence of unusual burning and chemical residue. This led archaeologists toward a remarkable possibility. According to one widely discussed theory, the Persians may have used an early form of chemical warfare during the siege. Excavators discovered traces of sulfur and bitumen within the tunnel system. When ignited in enclosed underground spaces, such materials could produce toxic gases capable of suffocating enemy soldiers. If correct, the bodies beneath Dura-Europos may represent some of the earliest archaeological evidence of chemical warfare in human history. Yet even this explanation leaves unanswered questions. Why were some bodies piled together in certain sections, while others remained isolated? Why did portions of the tunnel appear deliberately sealed afterward? And perhaps most intriguingly, why were several of the dead never clearly identified as either Roman defenders or Persian attackers? The uncertainty surrounding their identities has become part of the mystery itself. Some researchers believe the remains belonged primarily to Roman soldiers trapped during countermining operations beneath the walls. Others argue that Persian troops may also have died in the confined spaces after igniting toxic substances. In the chaos of tunnel warfare, visibility would have been almost non-existent. Smoke, darkness, collapsing earth, and poisoned air could easily have turned the underground passages into death traps for both sides. But there are more unusual interpretations as well. A few historians have questioned whether all of the bodies were connected directly to combat. Could some individuals have been laborers, prisoners, or civilians forced underground during the siege? Certain skeletons reportedly lacked standard military equipment, complicating efforts at identification. Then there are the stranger theories that linger at the edges of the discussion. Because Dura-Europos was not merely a military fortress, it was also a deeply religious city filled with temples, shrines, and sacred imagery from multiple cultures. Some speculative writers have wondered whether parts of the underground network served ceremonial or restricted functions before the siege began. Others suggest hidden chambers beneath the walls may still remain undiscovered, sealed during the city's final days. There is little evidence supporting such claims directly, yet the atmosphere surrounding the site continues to encourage questions. The city itself was remarkably well preserved after its destruction, because invading forces partially buried sections of the walls during siege operations. Sand and debris protected murals, buildings, and artifacts for centuries beneath the desert surface. If so much survived unnoticed beneath the earth, what else may still remain hidden there? Standing among the ruins today, the silence feels almost unnatural. Wind moves across empty streets where soldiers once prepared for an approaching army. Beneath the collapsed fortifications lie tunnels where men fought and died in darkness beneath the city itself. Who were the unidentified bodies beneath those walls? What exactly happened during the final hours of the siege? And are the known remains only a fraction of what still lies buried beneath Dura-Europos, waiting beneath layers of dust for future excavations to uncover? For now, the dead beneath the walls remain largely anonymous, suspended between archaeology and uncertainty, their final moments preserved inside one of the ancient world's most haunting underground mysteries. The ruins of Dura-Europos remind us that entire chapters of history can vanish beneath earth and silence, leaving behind only fragments of lives interrupted without warning. But sometimes, what disappears is not a city or a battlefield. Sometimes it is knowledge itself, systems, techniques, and craftsmanship so advanced that later generations struggle to understand how they were achieved in the first place. Across the Indian subcontinent, hidden beneath forests, farmland, and layers of ancient soil, archaeologists have uncovered traces of furnaces, slag heaps, iron tools, and abandoned industrial sites dating back more than 2,000 years. At first glance, the remains appear ordinary: broken clay structures blackened by heat, scattered fragments of ore, and remnants of charcoal buried deep underground. Yet together, they point toward something remarkable. During the rise of the Mauryan Empire in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, ancient India became one of the largest and most administratively sophisticated empires of the ancient world. Under rulers such as Chandragupta Maurya and Ashoka, roads connected distant regions, trade expanded across Asia, and massive construction projects transformed the landscape. Supporting this empire required immense technological capability. Among the Mauryans' greatest achievements may have been their mastery of iron production. Archaeological evidence suggests that Indian metalworkers of this period possessed highly refined smelting techniques capable of producing durable tools, weapons, agricultural equipment, and structural materials on a large scale. Some historians believe these workshops laid the foundation for later metallurgical traditions that would astonish travelers centuries afterward. But here, the mystery begins. Despite evidence of advanced ironworking during the Mauryan era, many of the empire's major production centers seem to vanish from the historical record with surprising suddenness. Furnace complexes appear abandoned. Specialized techniques become difficult to trace. Detailed records describing large-scale industrial organization are strangely scarce. Where did these workshops go? The mainstream explanation focuses on political collapse. After the death of Ashoka in the 3rd century BC, the Mauryan Empire gradually weakened through internal fragmentation, regional revolts, and economic decline. As centralized authority faded, large imperial industries may have broken apart into smaller local operations no longer visible archaeologically on the same scale. Environmental factors may also have contributed. Iron smelting required enormous quantities of wood converted into charcoal. Deforestation around industrial zones could have exhausted local resources, forcing workshops to relocate or shut down entirely. Floods, changing river systems, and shifting trade routes may have further disrupted production networks. Yet several aspects of the mystery remain difficult to explain. Some excavated sites reveal unexpectedly sophisticated furnace designs and temperature control methods that appear advanced for their time. In certain regions, high-quality iron production seems to decline sharply despite continued access to raw materials. Even more puzzling, later communities occupying nearby areas sometimes show little evidence of preserving the earlier industrial knowledge. How does an advanced technical tradition fade so completely? Ancient Indian texts contain scattered references to specialized guilds and protected craft knowledge passed carefully between generations. Some historians believe ironworking techniques may have been guarded secrets known only to highly trained artisan groups. If political instability disrupted these networks, critical knowledge could have disappeared rapidly. Others suggest the workshops were never entirely lost, but intentionally hidden. A number of ancient metallurgical sites remain buried beneath dense forests or isolated terrain that has seen limited excavation. Remote regions of central and southern India still contain unexplored slag deposits and abandoned furnaces stretching across vast areas. Researchers using satellite imagery have identified unusual patterns beneath vegetation that may indicate additional industrial complexes waiting to be studied. And then there are the more speculative theories. Some writers have connected the disappearance of Mauryan ironworking centers to legends surrounding extraordinary ancient metals described in later traditions: blades resistant to corrosion, pillars that survived centuries without rusting, and techniques supposedly impossible to reproduce fully today. A few fringe researchers argue that certain metallurgical methods were deliberately concealed or restricted after periods of political upheaval. Others wonder whether the workshops served purposes beyond ordinary industry, because iron in many ancient cultures carried symbolic and ritual significance alongside practical value. Could some production centers have operated under royal or religious protection, making their closure part of a larger social transformation within the empire? There is little direct evidence supporting such ideas. Yet the mystery persists because fragments of the technology continue to impress modern researchers. Some surviving ancient Indian iron artifacts demonstrate exceptional resistance to corrosion and remarkable structural quality even after centuries of exposure. The question is not whether the Mauryans understood ironworking. Clearly they did. The deeper question is how extensive that knowledge truly became, and why so much of its organizational structure seems to disappear into silence after the empire's decline. Standing at these abandoned workshop sites today, surrounded by blackened earth and scattered furnace remains, it becomes possible to imagine the scale of activity that once filled them. Fires burning through the night, workers shaping glowing metal beneath clouds of sparks, caravans transporting tools and weapons across imperial roads stretching toward distant provinces. Then, gradually, the furnaces cooled. What happened to the craftsmen who mastered these techniques? Did their knowledge survive quietly within isolated communities? Were some industrial centers abandoned before they could ever be fully documented? Or do hidden workshop complexes still lie buried beneath forests and fields, preserving clues to technologies the ancient world once considered extraordinary? For now, the vanished iron workshops of the Mauryan Empire remain suspended between archaeology and forgotten engineering, reminding us how easily even advanced knowledge can fade from history when the civilizations protecting it begin to disappear. The disappearance of the Mauryan iron workshops reminds us that some of history's greatest mysteries are not always found in royal tombs or legendary temples. Sometimes they exist beneath the ground itself, hidden corridors, sealed chambers, and underground networks built for purposes that later generations can only guess at. In the dry plains of northern Iraq, surrounded by open desert and distant hills, the ancient city of Hatra rises from the landscape like the remains of a forgotten fortress kingdom. Massive stone walls still encircle the ruins, their towers weathered by centuries of heat, wind, and war. Arched temples stand partially intact beneath the sky, while shattered statues and faded carvings hint at a city that once stood between empires and survived against impossible odds. To ancient travelers, Hatra must have seemed almost indestructible. Founded sometime before the 1st century AD, the city became a wealthy and heavily fortified center positioned between the Roman and Parthian worlds. Caravan routes crossing Mesopotamia brought merchants, soldiers, priests, and diplomats through its gates. Influences from Greek, Persian, Mesopotamian, and Arab cultures blended together within its streets and sanctuaries. Most remarkably, Hatra resisted repeated military assaults that destroyed many neighboring cities. Roman armies attempted to capture it more than once. Ancient accounts describe sieges, encirclements, and attacks against its towering defensive walls. Yet Hatra survived for generations, earning a reputation as one of the strongest fortress cities of the ancient Near East. And that reputation has led historians toward one of the city's enduring mysteries. Because beneath the visible ruins, evidence suggests the existence of underground tunnels and hidden passageways running beneath portions of the city itself. Some tunnels are known. Archaeologists have identified subsurface chambers, water systems, storage spaces, and partially collapsed corridors beneath certain structures. Ancient cities commonly relied on underground engineering for survival during sieges, especially in arid environments where controlling water access could determine whether a city endured or fell. But Hatra's underground network appears unusually complex. Local traditions and early excavation reports described sealed entrances, buried shafts, and unexplored subterranean passages extending beyond the known foundations. In some areas, Hollow spaces beneath the ruins have reportedly been detected, but never fully excavated due to instability and collapse risks. What exactly lies beneath the city remains uncertain. The mainstream explanation is practical. Hatra likely developed extensive underground systems to support defense, storage, and water management during prolonged sieges. Hidden escape routes or supply tunnels would not have been unusual for a city facing repeated military threats. Yet several details continue to intrigue researchers. Some underground sections appear disconnected from obvious military functions. Narrow corridors lead toward sealed chambers whose original purposes remain unclear. Certain subterranean spaces were intentionally filled with debris and antiquity, as though someone wished to block access permanently. Why? One possibility is simple structural protection. Collapsing or abandoned tunnels were often sealed to prevent accidents or enemy infiltration. But other theories suggest more deliberate concealment may have occurred during the city's final years. In the 3rd century AD, Hatra eventually fell after a siege by the Sasanian Persians. Historical sources describing the conquest are fragmented and partly legendary. Some later traditions even speak of betrayal from within the city, though historians debate how much truth survives in such accounts. What is clear is that after the conquest, parts of Hatra were abandoned, damaged, or gradually buried beneath centuries of desert accumulation. And somewhere beneath those ruins, portions of the underground network may still remain untouched. A number of speculative theories have emerged over the years. Some researchers wonder whether the tunnels connected directly to royal or religious compounds, allowing priests or rulers to move unseen during times of crisis. Hatra's temples were among the most important in the region, dedicated to a mixture of local deities and broader Mesopotamian traditions. Could underground chambers have been used for restricted ceremonies, sacred storage, or rituals hidden from the general population? Others focus on the city's strategic wealth. As a major caravan center, Hatra accumulated enormous resources through trade and taxation. It is possible valuable archives, treasures, or ceremonial objects were concealed underground during the final siege and never recovered. There are also darker interpretations. Some local stories describe entire tunnel sections collapsing during the city's destruction, trapping defenders or refugees beneath the earth. Though unverified, such accounts contribute to the unsettling atmosphere surrounding the ruins. Archaeologists working at ancient siege sites often encounter sudden collapses, hidden voids, and chambers sealed for centuries. At Hatra, those possibilities remain especially difficult to investigate because large portions of the site have suffered damage from both natural erosion and modern conflict. Yet even now, satellite surveys and limited excavations continue revealing structures previously unknown beneath the visible city. Standing inside Hatra today, surrounded by towering stone walls and silent temple courts, it is difficult not to imagine what may still exist below. Beneath the desert floor could lie forgotten corridors untouched since the city's final days, passages once crossed by soldiers carrying supplies during a siege, priests guarding sacred objects, or rulers attempting to preserve their kingdom as enemy armies gathered outside the gates. How extensive were the hidden tunnels beneath Hatra? Were they merely defensive structures, or part of something larger concealed beneath the fortress city? And if unexplored chambers still survive underground, what traces of Hatra's final years might still remain sealed in darkness beneath the desert stone? For now, the buried passages beneath Hatra remain suspended between archaeology, legend, and silence, waiting beneath the ruins of one of the ancient world's most resilient lost cities. The buried tunnels beneath Hatra suggest that some ancient civilizations hid their most important secrets underground, beyond the reach of invaders and time itself. But other mysteries were hidden in plain sight, etched into temple ceilings, carved into sacred walls, and placed deliberately beneath the gaze of the stars. Along the Nile River, Where the desert meets narrow bands of fertile land, the great temples of late Ptolemaic Egypt still rise from the landscape with an almost unreal stillness. Massive stone columns cast long shadows beneath the sun. Hieroglyphs cover walls from floor to ceiling. Deep within dim sanctuaries, the air feels cool and strangely preserved, as though the silence itself has survived from another age. It is here, inside temples such as Dendera, Esna, and Edfu, that researchers encountered a series of symbols unlike most known Egyptian inscriptions. At first glance, they appear familiar: stars, celestial boats, circles, divine figures, and geometric patterns associated with Egyptian astronomy and religious cosmology. Ancient Egyptian priests observed the heavens carefully for centuries, linking the movement of stars and planets to ritual calendars, agricultural cycles, and sacred ceremonies. But among the recognizable imagery are stranger markings, symbols whose meanings remain uncertain even today. Some appear only rarely within temple ceilings and hidden chambers constructed during the late Ptolemaic period, roughly between the 3rd and 1st centuries BC. Others are arranged in unusual combinations not easily matched with standard Egyptian religious iconography. A few resemble stylized astronomical diagrams, whose exact interpretations continue to divide scholars. What were these symbols meant to represent? The mainstream explanation begins with the complexity of Egyptian temple symbolism itself. By the Ptolemaic era, Egyptian religious traditions had already evolved over thousands of years. Priests combined older sacred systems with Greek astronomical knowledge introduced after the conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great. Temples became centers not only of worship, but also of advanced calendrical and cosmological study. Many historians believe the unusual symbols simply reflect highly specialized theological concepts understood only by elite priesthoods trained in sacred astronomy. And yet, certain details remain difficult to explain fully. Some inscriptions appear disconnected from known constellations or planetary systems used elsewhere in Egyptian or Greek traditions. Circular diagrams found in temple ceilings contain figures whose arrangement does not correspond neatly with conventional zodiac structures. Other symbols seem intentionally abstract, almost coded in appearance. One of the most debated examples comes from the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, where elaborate astronomical ceilings combine recognizable zodiac imagery with enigmatic figures and celestial markers. Researchers have proposed countless interpretations over the decades: ritual calendars, eclipse records, symbolic maps of the heavens, or representations of cosmic cycles tied to Egyptian theology. But consensus remains elusive. Part of the mystery lies in the late Ptolemaic period itself. Egypt at this time stood at the crossroads of multiple intellectual traditions. Greek mathematics, Babylonian astronomy, and ancient Egyptian cosmology increasingly overlapped within temple scholarship. Priests operating within these sanctuaries may have developed systems of symbolic knowledge unlike anything preserved elsewhere. If so, much of that knowledge may now be lost, because many temple inscriptions were never designed for ordinary readers. Sacred texts and celestial diagrams often served restricted ritual functions accessible only to initiated priests. Certain chambers within the temples were intentionally dark, hidden, or difficult to access, suggesting that some knowledge was meant to remain concealed. This has naturally encouraged more speculative theories. A number of fringe researchers argue the unidentified symbols represent forgotten astronomical observations far more advanced than historians currently recognize. Some point to unusual star alignments or mathematical proportions embedded within temple architecture itself. Others speculate that the symbols encoded long-term celestial cycles, catastrophic events, or predictive systems now impossible to reconstruct completely. There are even theories suggesting the symbols preserved fragments of older knowledge inherited from civilizations predating dynastic Egypt. Though mainstream scholars strongly question such claims, the persistence of unexplained imagery continues to fuel debate. And then there is the atmosphere of the temples themselves. Deep inside certain sanctuaries, ceiling carvings depicting stars and celestial beings emerge gradually from darkness as light moves across the stone. The symbols seem less decorative than deliberate, as though they formed part of a larger cosmological language meant to connect earthly ritual with the heavens above. Were these symbols purely religious, scientific, symbolic, or some combination modern categories fail to capture fully? The mystery grows deeper because many inscriptions survive only partially damaged. Centuries of erosion, earthquakes, looting, and later construction have erased sections that may once have clarified their meaning. In some chambers, unfinished carvings suggest temple work stopped abruptly, leaving certain astronomical programs incomplete forever. Standing beneath these ancient ceilings today, it becomes difficult not to wonder what knowledge the priests believed they were preserving in stone. Did the symbols record precise observations of the night sky, hidden ritual teachings, cycles of time no longer understood? Or are modern researchers simply missing the key required to read a symbolic language once considered sacred? For now, the unidentified astronomical symbols of the late Ptolemaic temples remain suspended between archaeology, astronomy, and forgotten theology, silent constellations carved into stone, waiting beneath the Egyptian darkness for someone to understand what they were truly meant to reveal. The celestial symbols carved into the temples of late Ptolemaic Egypt suggest that some ancient mysteries were designed to be read by only a select few. Hidden knowledge was not always buried underground or sealed behind stone walls. Sometimes it was encoded into sacred architecture itself, preserved quietly across centuries while its meaning faded from memory. But in other places, the secrets were hidden beneath entire cities. In the heart of central Turkey, across a landscape shaped by volcanic rock and endless erosion, the region of Cappadocia appears almost unreal. Towering stone formations rise from the earth like frozen pillars. Valleys twist through pale cliffs carved by wind and time. From above, the terrain resembles something ancient and unfinished, as though the land itself conceals another world beneath its surface. And in many ways, it does. Below the hills and villages of Cappadocia lies one of the most astonishing underground networks ever discovered. Entire subterranean cities stretch downward through soft volcanic stone. Narrow corridors, hidden chambers, ventilation shafts, storage rooms, wells, kitchens, animal enclosures, and places of worship carved deep beneath the earth. Some descend multiple levels underground. Others appear connected through tunnels extending far beyond the limits of the known excavated areas. The most famous examples, such as Derinkuyu and Kaymakli, reveal underground complexes capable of sheltering thousands of people for extended periods of time. Massive circular stone doors could seal passages from within. Sophisticated ventilation systems brought air deep into the underground chambers. Entire communities may have survived below ground during invasions, wars, or periods of instability. Yet despite decades of excavation, one mystery continues to unsettle archaeologists and historians alike. How extensive are the underground expansions beneath Cappadocia, really? Because evidence increasingly suggests that what has already been uncovered may represent only a fraction of the hidden network. The mainstream explanation for the underground cities is practical and historically grounded. Cappadocia's soft volcanic rock made excavation relatively easy, while the region's turbulent history created strong incentives for underground refuge. Over centuries, local populations expanded earlier tunnels into larger defensive systems capable of protecting entire communities during raids and military threats. Many historians believe the underground cities evolved gradually over long periods, rather than being constructed all at once. But certain details remain difficult to explain completely. Some tunnels descend far deeper than would seem necessary for temporary shelter. Others lead toward sealed or collapsed sections that remain inaccessible even today. In several locations, newly discovered passages have appeared unexpectedly during modern construction projects, revealing additional underground spaces unknown to archaeologists. One of the most puzzling aspects involves the apparent scale of coordination required to create such networks. Who organized these expansions? Over what period of time? And how did ancient communities engineer ventilation, water access, and structural stability so effectively beneath entire settlements? The deeper researchers investigate, the more complicated the picture becomes. Some underground chambers show evidence of habitation from different historical eras layered atop one another, suggesting the tunnels were reused and expanded repeatedly across centuries. Hittites, Phrygians, early Christians, Byzantine communities, and later populations may all have contributed to the underground systems in different ways. Yet there are portions of the networks whose original purposes remain uncertain. Certain narrow tunnels appear too small for efficient movement, yet connect distant sections with surprising precision. Other chambers seem isolated from the main living areas entirely. Some researchers believe these spaces may have served ritual, storage, or emergency functions now lost to history. Then there are the more speculative interpretations. A number of fringe theories propose that Cappadocia's underground expansions originated far earlier than currently accepted, perhaps built upon forgotten systems created by civilizations whose identities are no longer known. Others point toward legends describing hidden passageways connecting distant settlements beneath the region. There is little direct evidence supporting such claims on a large scale. Still, unexplored sections continue to emerge. Ground-penetrating surveys in parts of Cappadocia have reportedly identified additional voids and tunnel systems extending beyond mapped areas. In some cases, excavations stopped due to instability or flooding before researchers could determine where the passages led. And perhaps that uncertainty is what gives the underground cities their strange atmosphere. Deep below the surface, the tunnels become silent except for the sound of footsteps and moving air. Narrow corridors twist unpredictably through darkness. Ancient rooms appear suddenly beyond tight stone passages, blackened by smoke from fires lit centuries ago. In certain sections, no one can say with certainty how long it has been since another human being entered. Why were some areas sealed intentionally? Were all the tunnels defensive in purpose, or did they serve deeper social or religious functions? Could entire undiscovered sections still remain hidden beneath the modern towns and valleys above? The mystery grows larger with each new discovery, because Cappadocia is not merely a collection of underground shelters. It is an evolving labyrinth shaped across generations, expanded by people who believed safety, or perhaps secrecy, could only be found beneath the earth itself. And somewhere within those dark corridors, beyond the mapped chambers open to visitors today, there may still exist hidden passages untouched since antiquity, waiting beneath the stone for someone willing to descend deeper into the underground silence. The underground cities of Cappadocia reveal how entire communities once disappeared beneath the earth to survive uncertain times. Hidden corridors, sealed chambers, and forgotten passageways remind us that history is often preserved in silence, waiting beneath layers of stone and dust to be rediscovered centuries later. But some vanished places were not hidden underground at all. Some stood openly along the busiest roads of the ancient world, until the roads themselves faded into emptiness. Across the vast deserts and mountain corridors of Central Asia, the Silk Road once connected distant civilizations through an immense network of trade routes stretching from China to the Mediterranean world. Merchants carried silk, spices, manuscripts, gemstones, and religious ideas across landscapes so remote that entire caravans could disappear without leaving a trace. And along these routes, Scattered between oasis towns and mountain passes stood hundreds of Buddhist monasteries. Today, many of them are gone. Some survive only as weathered cave shrines carved into cliffs. Others remain buried beneath drifting desert sands. A few vanished so completely that historians know of their existence only through fragments of travel records written by pilgrims centuries ago. The mystery surrounding these lost monasteries is not simply that they disappeared, it is how many disappeared with so little explanation. During the first centuries AD, Buddhism spread rapidly across the Silk Road through networks of merchants, monks, and royal patronage. Monasteries became more than places of worship. They served as resting stations for travelers, centers of learning, repositories of sacred texts, and safe havens in dangerous territory. Pilgrims moving between India, Central Asia, and China relied on them for shelter and guidance. Some monastery complexes grew remarkably wealthy. Ancient travelers described elaborate temples decorated with murals, libraries filled with manuscripts, and communities of monks living in remote desert valleys, sustained by trade flowing across the Silk Road. In regions such as the Tarim Basin, Bactria, and the mountain passes near modern western China and Afghanistan, Buddhist institutions flourished for centuries in places that today seem almost uninhabitable. Then, gradually, many of them vanished. The mainstream historical explanation points toward changing political and economic conditions. As trade routes shifted, certain oasis towns declined. Invasions, regional wars, and the rise of competing powers disrupted the fragile stability that sustained monastic communities. Climate change and desertification may also have contributed, especially in regions where water sources became unreliable. By the end of the first millennium AD, many Silk Road networks had fragmented or moved elsewhere. But archaeologists continue to encounter puzzling details. Some abandoned monasteries show evidence of orderly departure rather than violent destruction. Sacred objects were removed carefully. Libraries appear intentionally emptied. In a few locations, rooms were sealed before abandonment, almost as though the inhabitants expected to return one day. Yet they never did. At certain sites, traces of occupation seem to stop abruptly despite the continued survival of nearby settlements. Why would thriving religious centers disappear while surrounding communities endured? The deeper researchers investigate, the stranger the pattern becomes. In the deserts near Dunhuang and along sections of the ancient northern Silk Road, explorers discovered hidden caches of manuscripts sealed inside caves for centuries. Thousands of Buddhist texts, paintings, and documents survived only because they had been deliberately concealed behind walls and forgotten. Who hid them, and why? Some scholars believe monks protected sacred writings during periods of instability or invasion. Others suggest internal religious changes may have caused older texts to be stored away permanently rather than destroyed. And then there are the more speculative theories. A few researchers have wondered whether some monasteries functioned as part of larger hidden networks extending beyond ordinary trade activity. Certain remote sites were built in locations difficult to access even under ideal conditions. Why establish major centers of learning so far from population centers unless isolation itself held spiritual or strategic importance? Others focus on persistent legends describing missing caravans, sealed cave temples, and hidden valleys where monks supposedly carried sacred manuscripts before entire communities disappeared into the mountains. There is little concrete evidence supporting such stories directly. Yet the geography of the Silk Road leaves room for uncertainty. Vast regions remain archaeologically underexplored due to political instability, harsh terrain, and shifting desert landscapes. Entire settlements have emerged unexpectedly from beneath the sand after centuries of burial. It is possible more monasteries still remain hidden, and perhaps that possibility explains the strange atmosphere surrounding these places. In abandoned cave temples, Faded murals still stare outward from walls untouched for centuries. Wind moves through empty meditation chambers where monks once copied sacred texts by candlelight. Desert silence fills corridors once crossed by travelers carrying news from worlds thousands of miles apart. What caused these communities to disappear so completely? Were the monasteries victims of slow economic decline, sudden political collapse, or something less visible unfolding across generations of isolation and change? And if entire libraries and sanctuaries remained hidden for centuries before being rediscovered by accident, how many more forgotten monasteries might still lie buried beneath the deserts and mountains of the ancient Silk Road, waiting quietly beyond the edges of recorded history? The vanished monasteries of the Silk Road remind us that wealth is not always measured in gold or precious stones. Sometimes entire civilizations guarded knowledge, manuscripts, and sacred traditions more carefully than treasure itself. But throughout history, there have also been fortunes so immense that their disappearance left behind legends powerful enough to survive for centuries. In the rugged mountains and valleys of ancient Macedon, where cold mist gathers across forests and stone ruins overlook narrow passes, traces of a lost kingdom still linger beneath the landscape. Broken fortifications stand above rivers that once carried armies toward war. Isolated tombs emerge unexpectedly from hillsides. Beneath layers of earth and vegetation lie remnants of a royal dynasty that once ruled one of the most formidable kingdoms in the ancient world. And somewhere within that history, according to ancient accounts, an enormous treasury vanished. Its owner was King Perseus of Macedon, the final ruler of the Antigonid dynasty and the last king to stand against the growing power of Rome. By the 2nd century BC, Macedon remained wealthy from generations of conquest, trade, tribute, and inherited royal riches tracing back to the legacy of Alexander the Great. But Rome was expanding rapidly. In 168 BC, the conflict between Rome and Macedon reached its decisive moment at the Battle of Pydna. Roman forces defeated Perseus in a battle that shattered Macedonian resistance and permanently altered the balance of power in the Mediterranean world. Soon afterward, Perseus fled. Ancient historians describe a king retreating with portions of his royal treasury while Roman armies closed in. Gold, silver, military funds, ceremonial objects, and royal reserves were reportedly moved during the chaos surrounding Macedon's collapse. Yet much of that wealth was never clearly accounted for. Roman records confirm that enormous riches were seized after the war. Triumphs held in Rome displayed captured treasure from Macedon before cheering crowds. But several ancient sources also suggest that significant portions of Perseus's treasury disappeared before the Romans could secure them, and that disappearance became one of antiquity's enduring mysteries. The mainstream explanation is practical. In the confusion of military defeat, treasure was likely scattered, stolen, hidden, or absorbed quietly into local networks long before accurate accounting became possible. Royal attendants, fleeing soldiers, opportunistic officials, and regional allies may all have taken portions of the wealth. Some historians believe Perseus himself deliberately concealed valuables while attempting escape. But where? Ancient references point toward hidden locations in mountainous terrain, isolated strongholds, and coastal areas near the king's final movements before surrender. Macedon's geography made concealment entirely possible. Dense forests, caves, fortified hills, and remote valleys provided countless locations where treasure could vanish almost permanently. And despite centuries of searching, no confirmed discovery of the missing royal treasury has ever emerged. The mystery deepens because of the scale involved. This was not a single chest of coins. Royal treasuries in the Hellenistic world often contained generations of accumulated wealth. Bullion reserves, diplomatic gifts, military payrolls, ceremonial weapons, jewelry, and sacred objects connected to dynastic legitimacy. If even a fraction disappeared, the missing fortune may have been enormous. Some archaeologists suspect portions remain buried somewhere in northern Greece or neighboring regions once controlled by Macedon. Others believe the treasure was divided intentionally into smaller hidden caches to avoid total capture by Rome. Then there are the stranger possibilities. Several ancient traditions describe royal agents entrusted with secret transport missions during the final collapse of Perseus's kingdom. According to later legends, certain escorts vanished completely while carrying sealed containers away from advancing Roman forces. Did they hide the treasure successfully, or simply disappear into the turmoil of war? Some speculative theories suggest underground chambers beneath abandoned Macedonian fortresses may still contain undiscovered deposits connected to the lost treasury. Others focus on ancient burial mounds and tomb complexes that remain only partially excavated. There are even stories of sacred objects tied to the Macedonian royal line being concealed separately from ordinary wealth, protected not for monetary value but for political symbolism. Though historians treat such accounts cautiously, they reflect how deeply the mystery entered regional folklore over time. And perhaps what makes the story so compelling is the silence surrounding the end itself. Perseus eventually surrendered to Rome and spent the remainder of his life in captivity. Yet no definitive account explains what happened to all the wealth once controlled by the Macedonian crown. Roman writers celebrated victory over Macedon, but even they seemed uncertain about the treasury's final fate. Standing among the ruins of ancient Macedonian fortresses today, it becomes easier to imagine how something valuable could disappear into the landscape forever. Beneath hills covered in forest and stone may lie forgotten chambers untouched since the final days of the kingdom. Hidden caves, buried caches, sealed passages abandoned during desperate attempts to outrun an empire. What exactly vanished with King Perseus during the collapse of Macedon? Was the missing treasury scattered long ago across the ancient world, or could parts of it still remain concealed beneath the mountains where the last Macedonian king made his final retreat? For now, the lost treasury of Perseus remains suspended between history and legend, a fortune swallowed by war, silence, and the uncertain final days of a kingdom standing at the edge of extinction. The missing treasury of King Perseus reminds us that history often leaves behind traces of power without fully explaining where that power finally disappeared. Gold vanishes, kingdoms collapse, entire fortunes dissolve into rumor and fragmented records. Yet some mysteries are carved directly into stone. Massive, silent monuments whose very existence continues to challenge what historians thought they understood about the ancient world. Deep within the tropical lowlands of Mesoamerica, surrounded by dense forests, rivers, and humid swamps, enormous stone faces emerge unexpectedly from the earth. Their expressions are calm but imposing. Wide noses, tightly pressed lips, and heavy helmets stare outward from blocks of basalt weighing as much as 40 tons. Some stand partially buried beneath vegetation. Others sit isolated in museum courtyards, removed from the landscapes where they were first uncovered. These are the colossal heads associated with the Olmec civilization, one of the earliest major cultures of ancient Mesoamerica. Most known examples were discovered in the Gulf Coast regions of present-day southern Mexico, particularly near sites such as San Lorenzo and La Venta. Carved roughly between 1200 and 400 BC, the heads are widely believed to represent rulers, warriors, or elite figures connected to Olmec political and religious authority. But not all of the giant heads fit neatly within the expected geography of the Olmec world. Over time, reports emerged describing Olmec-style sculptures and colossal stone heads discovered far beyond the civilization's recognized core territories. Some were fragmentary. Others appeared stylistically unusual. A few discoveries occurred in regions where large-scale Olmec presence remains debated by archaeologists. And this is where the mystery begins. How did such enormous monuments appear outside the traditional centers of Olmec civilization? Were they transported across vast distances through trade and political influence? Or do they point toward a larger and less understood network of cultural expansion than historians once believed? The mainstream explanation focuses on the extraordinary reach of Olmec influence during the early formative period of Mesoamerican history. Archaeological evidence confirms that Olmec artistic styles, religious symbols, and trade goods spread widely across neighboring regions. Obsidian, jade, ceramics, and ritual imagery traveled through extensive exchange networks linking distant communities. Some researchers believe the outlying colossal heads reflect this broader cultural influence. Local elites may have adopted Olmec artistic traditions to reinforce political legitimacy or spiritual authority. But several details remain difficult to explain fully. The transportation alone raises questions. Many colossal heads were carved from volcanic basalt sourced from specific mountain regions, sometimes located dozens of miles from where the monuments were ultimately placed. Moving such immense stones through swamps, rivers, and forests without wheeled transport would have required astonishing organization and labor. If confirmed examples existed even farther beyond the Olmec heartland, the logistical challenge becomes even more remarkable. Then there are the stylistic differences. Certain outlying sculptures possess features that do not align perfectly with the better-known heads found at major Olmec centers. Some appear more abstract. Others show variations in facial structure, helmet design, or carving technique. Are these simply regional adaptations, or evidence of entirely different groups inspired by Olmec traditions? The uncertainty has fueled decades of speculation. A number of fringe theories argue that the giant heads point toward a far more widespread and interconnected civilization than mainstream archaeology currently accepts. Some propose forgotten migration routes linking distant regions of Mesoamerica long before established trade systems. Others suggest the heads preserve traces of political alliances or ceremonial networks extending across territories still only partially understood. More controversial theories move even further beyond accepted scholarship, claiming the sculptures reflect contact with unknown transoceanic cultures or lost civilizations. Most archaeologists strongly reject such interpretations due to the lack of credible supporting evidence. Yet the sheer scale and unusual distribution of certain discoveries continue to invite questions from both researchers and the public. Part of the mystery also comes from how incomplete the archaeological picture remains. Dense jungle environments conceal ancient settlements with extraordinary efficiency. Entire ceremonial centers have emerged unexpectedly through aerial scanning and modern excavation technologies. In recent years, researchers using LiDAR imaging uncovered vast hidden urban networks beneath Mesoamerican forests once thought nearly empty. If so much remained hidden for centuries, what else may still lie buried beneath the vegetation? Some archaeologists suspect additional colossal heads or related monuments remain undiscovered in remote regions rarely excavated thoroughly. Others believe weathering and erosion may already have destroyed evidence capable of clarifying how far Olmec influence truly extended. Standing before one of the colossal heads today, the experience feels strangely personal. Despite their enormous scale, the faces appear individual, as though representing real people whose identities were once widely recognized but are now lost entirely. Their expressions reveal neither triumph nor fear, only silence. Who commissioned these monuments? Why were some placed so far beyond the expected boundaries of Olmec civilization? Were they symbols of conquest, diplomacy, sacred authority, or something modern researchers have not yet fully understood? And if additional heads still remain hidden beneath jungle soil and forgotten landscapes, What might they reveal about the true reach of one of the ancient America's most mysterious civilizations? For now, the outlying Olmec-style heads remain suspended between archaeology and uncertainty, massive stone witnesses to a past that may have been far more connected, complex, and mysterious than anyone once imagined. The colossal Olmec heads raise an unsettling possibility that entire networks of influence, knowledge, and cultural exchange may have existed far beyond what surviving records can fully explain. Across the ancient world, civilizations built archives to preserve memory against the erosion of time. Kings recorded victories, merchants tracked wealth, priests documented rituals, astronomy, and law. And yet, again and again, history's archives seem to disappear in moments of fire. On the western coast of ancient Anatolia, near the shimmering waters of the Aegean Sea, the ruins of Ephesus still stretch across the landscape in weathered marble and fractured stone. Broad streets lined with columns descend toward what was once one of the greatest cities of the Roman world. Temples, bathhouses, theaters, and marketplaces remain partially intact beneath the Mediterranean sun, preserving echoes of a city that once connected Europe, Asia, and the wider ancient world through trade and scholarship. Among the most famous structures at Ephesus stood the Library of Celsus. Even in ruin, its towering facade still commands attention. Built in the 2nd century AD, the library served not only as a repository of manuscripts, but also as a monument to prestige and intellectual power. Thousands of scrolls were once stored within carefully designed chambers intended to protect texts from humidity and decay. But historians believe the library itself may have represented only a fraction of the written material preserved in Ephesus. Administrative archives, temple records, legal documents, trade contracts, and private collections likely existed throughout the city. Ephesus was one of the largest urban centers in the eastern Mediterranean. Information flowed constantly through its ports and institutions. Then came the fire. Ancient sources describe destructive events striking Ephesus multiple times throughout its long history: earthquakes, invasions, riots, and urban fires that repeatedly reshaped the city. Sometime during the 3rd century AD, the Library of Celsus suffered catastrophic damage, traditionally linked to the Gothic invasions that swept through parts of the Roman Empire. The upper interior burned, scrolls vanished, and with them, entire sections of history may have disappeared forever. At first glance, the explanation appears tragically familiar. Ancient cities built with wooden roofs, oil lamps, and tightly packed structures were constantly vulnerable to fire. Warfare and civil unrest only increased the danger. Libraries across the ancient world, from Alexandria to Pergamon, faced similar threats. Yet the destruction at Ephesus continues to provoke questions, because some historians suspect the loss may have extended far beyond accidental urban damage. Fragments of surviving accounts hint that important archives disappeared unusually completely. Official records tied to commerce, regional governance, and temple administration seem strangely fragmented compared to the city's immense importance. Certain historical gaps surrounding Ephesus during periods of political transition remain difficult to reconstruct from surviving documents. Was this simply the natural result of fire and time, or did something more deliberate occur amid the chaos? The city occupied a sensitive position within the Roman world. Trade wealth, religious influence, and political rivalry all intersected there. During periods of instability, archives could become dangerous. Legal records, financial accounts, religious texts, and political correspondence carried enormous power in the ancient world. Some researchers have quietly wondered whether portions of the archives were intentionally removed before or during the destruction. There are reasons for caution with such theories. Ancient documentation rarely survives evenly across centuries, and absence alone is not proof of conspiracy or concealment. Still, Ephesus presents unusual silences. Certain temple records referenced indirectly by later writers no longer exist. Commercial networks operating through the city appear far larger than surviving archives suggest. Even the Library of Celsus itself may have held specialized collections whose contents remain entirely unknown. And then there are the more speculative possibilities. A handful of fringe theories claim hidden chambers beneath sections of ancient Ephesus may still contain sealed repositories untouched by the fires. Excavations beneath Roman cities often reveal layered construction phases, underground storage rooms, drainage systems, and collapsed vaults hidden for centuries beneath debris. At Ephesus, some subsurface structures remain only partially explored. Others focus on the city's powerful religious institutions. Before Christianity transformed the region, Ephesus was famous for the Temple of Artemis, one of the ancient world's great sacred centers. Could priesthoods or elite families have protected certain records separately from the public libraries? Were sensitive texts relocated during periods of unrest and never recovered? No definitive evidence confirms such ideas. Yet standing among the ruins today, the silence surrounding the lost archives feels strangely heavy. Marble streets once crowded with scholars and merchants now end in collapsed stone and empty chambers. Beneath the earth lie layers of destruction from centuries of rebuilding, invasion, and fire. Somewhere within those layers may have existed records capable of illuminating forgotten parts of the ancient Mediterranean world. Political alliances, scientific observations, religious disputes, personal correspondence, perhaps even histories no longer remembered at all. Instead, much of it vanished into smoke. What exactly was lost when the archives of Ephesus burned? Were all the records truly destroyed in the flames, or were some removed, hidden, or buried before the fire consumed the city's memory? For now, the strange destruction of the Ephesian archives remains suspended between documented history and unanswered absence, a reminder that some of the ancient world's greatest secrets may not have been erased completely, but simply hidden somewhere beneath the ruins where the fire once burned hottest. The fire that consumed the archives of Ephesus reminds us how easily knowledge can vanish from history. A single night of flames can erase generations of memory, leaving behind only fragments, rumors, and empty spaces in the historical record. Yet not every ancient fire was accidental. Some appear to have been deliberate, ritualistic, symbolic, perhaps even sacred. And few archaeological sites capture that unsettling possibility more clearly than Gournay-sur-Aronde. In the quiet countryside of northern France, surrounded today by farmland and gentle rolling fields, the remains of an ancient Celtic sanctuary lie hidden beneath layers of soil and centuries of silence. At first glance, the site appears unremarkable. Traces of ditches, post holes, broken weapons, and scattered fragments of bone buried deep underground. But beneath that simplicity lies one of the most mysterious ritual sites ever uncovered from Iron Age Europe. Discovered during excavations in the 1970s, Gournay-sur-Aronde revealed evidence of a large enclosed sanctuary used by Celtic communities sometime between the 4th and 2nd centuries BC. Archaeologists found an enormous concentration of damaged weapons deliberately deposited inside the sacred enclosure. Spears bent beyond use, shields shattered, swords twisted and broken as though intentionally destroyed after battle. Human and animal remains were discovered there as well. The deeper researchers excavated, the stranger the site became. Ancient Celtic societies left relatively few written records of their own, meaning much of what is known about their rituals comes from archaeology and descriptions written by outside observers, particularly Greek and Roman authors. Those accounts often described sacred groves, warrior offerings, and ceremonial practices tied closely to warfare and the supernatural. At Gournay-sur-Aronde, the physical evidence seemed to confirm at least part of those descriptions. but one detail stood out above all others. At some point, the sanctuary was consumed by fire. Archaeologists uncovered extensive signs of burning across sections of the site. Timber structures had collapsed. Sacred enclosures were destroyed. Ritual deposits were buried beneath layers of ash and charred debris. Yet the destruction did not resemble an ordinary attack or accidental blaze. Instead, many researchers believe the sanctuary may have been burned intentionally by the very people who used it. Why would a sacred site be deliberately destroyed? The mainstream explanation centers on ritual closure. Across many ancient cultures, temples and sanctuaries were sometimes dismantled, buried, or burned as part of ceremonial transitions. Sacred objects could be destroyed intentionally to release spiritual power, honor deities, or mark the ending of a ritual cycle. At Gournay-sur-Aronde, the deliberate breaking of weapons already suggests ceremonies involving symbolic destruction. Burning the sanctuary itself may have represented the final stage of a long-standing ritual tradition. Yet several aspects remain deeply uncertain. The site contains evidence of repeated activity across generations, suggesting the sanctuary held major importance for local communities. Why abandon and destroy such a place so completely? Was the fire part of a planned ceremonial act, or connected to political upheaval, invasion, or social collapse? Some archaeologists point to changing power structures among Celtic tribes during the Late Iron Age. Religious practices may have evolved. Rival groups may have sought to erase older sacred traditions. Others suggest increasing contact with the expanding Roman world disrupted established ritual systems long before direct conquest occurred. But there are more mysterious possibilities as well. Several Roman writers described Celtic sanctuaries in ways that blurred the line between religion and warfare. Sacred enclosures were sometimes linked to victory rituals, oaths, and communication with divine forces believed to influence battle itself. At Gournay-sur-Aronde, the sheer number of damaged weapons creates an atmosphere unlike most ordinary temples. Were these simply offerings from defeated enemies? Or did the rituals performed there involve deeper symbolic meanings now lost entirely? Some speculative theories suggest the sanctuary functioned as a restricted ceremonial center, reserved for elite warrior groups or priestly classes. Others wonder whether the burning marked a crisis within the community itself, a moment when sacred traditions were intentionally ended to prevent something from continuing. There is no direct evidence for such interpretations. Yet the emotional atmosphere of the site continues to affect researchers even today. Because unlike monumental Roman temples or Egyptian pyramids, Gournay-sur-Aronde feels intensely personal. The damaged weapons were touched by real hands. The burned wooden structures once stood around living ceremonies witnessed by people whose beliefs are now almost impossible to reconstruct fully. And then there is the unsettling question of the human remains. Fragments of bones found at the sanctuary have fueled debates for decades. Some scholars interpret them as evidence of ritual feasting, burial practices, or battlefield offerings. Others cautiously consider whether more disturbing rites may have taken place there, though evidence remains incomplete and heavily debated. Standing at the site today, little remains visible above the surface. Fields stretch quietly across the landscape where sacred fires once burned and ceremonies unfolded beneath the open sky. Yet beneath the soil lie traces of a world whose spiritual logic modern historians can only partially understand. Why was the sanctuary burned? What rituals ended there in fire and ash? And how many beliefs, stories, and sacred traditions disappeared alongside the smoke rising from Gournay-sur-Aronde more than 2,000 years ago? For now, the burned Celtic sanctuary remains suspended between archaeology and ritual mystery, a silent reminder that some ancient places were not abandoned by accident, but deliberately consumed in ways that may never be fully explained. The burned sanctuary at Gournay-sur-Aronde suggests that some ancient societies chose to destroy their sacred places deliberately, as though fire itself could erase, transform, or seal away something too powerful to remain. Across history, entire communities have vanished not only through invasion or disaster, but through slow and mysterious decline, leaving behind ruins filled with ordinary objects suddenly abandoned. And few places capture that quiet disappearance more hauntingly than Karanisin. At the edge of Egypt's Fayum oasis, where fertile farmland gives way to desert winds and endless pale sand, the ruins of the ancient city emerge low against the horizon. Mud brick walls crumble beneath the sun. Narrow streets stretch between collapsed houses frozen in silence. Pottery fragments, scraps of papyrus, broken tools, and abandoned household objects still surface from the ground after centuries of burial. Unlike monumental cities built for kings and emperors, Karanisin feels deeply human. Founded during the Ptolemaic period and flourishing under Roman rule, Karanisin was a thriving agricultural settlement sustained by canals branching from the Nile's irrigation systems. Farmers cultivated grain, olives, and grapes across the oasis. Temples dedicated to local and Greco-Egyptian deities stood among homes and workshops. Roman veterans settled there alongside Egyptian families, creating a multicultural community that endured for centuries. And because the dry desert climate preserved organic materials so well, Karanisin became one of the most important archaeological windows into everyday life in Roman Egypt. Thousands of papyrus documents were uncovered there. Tax records, letters, legal disputes, military notices, and personal correspondence revealing astonishing details about ordinary people living nearly 2,000 years ago. Then, sometime during the 4th and 5th centuries AD, the city began to collapse. By the early medieval period, Karanisin had been abandoned almost entirely. At first, historians believed the explanation was straightforward. Economic decline, shifting trade networks, political instability within the late Roman Empire, and environmental stress likely combined to weaken the settlement gradually. Irrigation systems required constant maintenance. If canals failed or water supplies diminished, agricultural communities in the Fayum region could become unsustainable surprisingly quickly. But the archaeological evidence tells a more complicated story. Certain sections of Karanisin appear to have been abandoned rapidly rather than slowly. Some homes contained objects left behind unexpectedly, as though residents departed without fully emptying their belongings. Administrative activity visible in papyrus records declines unevenly, creating gaps historians still struggle to explain. And perhaps most intriguingly, no single catastrophic event fully accounts for the city's disappearance. There is no clear evidence of large-scale warfare destroying Karanisin. No massive burn layers suggest invasion. No epidemic burial grounds have been identified conclusively. Instead, the city seems to fade gradually into silence while parts of it continued functioning intermittently. Why? The mainstream explanation focuses on environmental degradation. Over centuries, irrigation canals may have silted up or become increasingly difficult to maintain during periods of political fragmentation. Declining agricultural productivity could have triggered migration away from the city over generations. Yet some researchers believe environmental decline alone does not explain the strange patterns visible at the site. Karanisin was part of a broader network of settlements in the Fayum oasis, and not all neighboring communities disappeared at the same pace. Why did some survive longer while Karanisin declined more abruptly? The mystery deepens through the papyri themselves. The documents recovered from Karanisin reveal mounting economic pressures, tax burdens, and administrative complexity during the late Roman period. Some historians interpret these records as evidence of a society under increasing strain from imperial demands. Farmers struggled with debts, land ownership shifted, military obligations expanded. But even within those records, there are silences. Certain archives end unexpectedly. Some family histories simply stop. Entire sections of civic activity vanish from documentation without clear explanation. And then there are the more speculative theories. A few researchers have wondered whether disease outbreaks may have affected the population more severely than surviving evidence reveals. Others point toward social and religious transformations spreading across Egypt during late antiquity. Christianity expanded rapidly while older temple traditions declined. Could changing spiritual structures have altered the social foundations holding communities like Karanisin together? Some fringe theories go further, suggesting hidden political unrest, local revolts, or migrations triggered by regional instability that official records never fully captured. There is little direct evidence for dramatic conspiracies or sudden catastrophe. Yet Karanisin remains unsettling precisely because its disappearance feels incomplete. Not a city violently destroyed, but one gradually emptied of life while traces of ordinary existence remained behind. Walking through the ruins today, archaeologists still encounter echoes of daily routines abruptly interrupted. Storage jars remain inside abandoned rooms. Woven baskets survive in dry corners untouched for centuries. Fragments of personal letters preserve voices from a world that slowly disappeared into the desert without leaving a final explanation. What caused the people of Karanisin to leave? Was the city undone by environmental collapse, economic pressure, political change, or by several forces unfolding together so gradually that no single generation fully recognized the end approaching? And if entire archives of everyday life survived beneath the sands for centuries, what other forgotten stories from the final days of Roman Egypt may still remain hidden beneath the desert floor, waiting quietly to be uncovered? For now, the collapse of Karanisin remains suspended between archaeology and absence, a haunting reminder that civilizations do not always end in sudden catastrophe. Sometimes they simply fade, one abandoned house at a time, until only silence remains beneath the Egyptian sun. The silent collapse of Karanisin reminds us that ancient civilizations did not always vanish in fire or conquest. Sometimes communities simply drifted away from places that had once seemed permanent, leaving behind homes, temples, and sacred spaces slowly reclaimed by sand and time. Across the deserts once controlled by the Nabataeans, that silence still lingers. Far from the crowded stone facades of Petra, beyond the caravan roads and monumental tombs that made the Nabataean kingdom famous, isolated shrines stand scattered across remote valleys and rocky desert plateaus. Some are carved directly into sandstone cliffs. Others consist of simple stone enclosures exposed to wind and endless sun. In certain locations, weathered altars and ceremonial platforms remain positioned carefully beside ancient pathways, now barely visible beneath drifting sand. Many of these sites feel strangely hidden, as though they were never intended for ordinary travelers. The Nabataeans, flourishing between roughly the 4th century BC and the 2nd century AD, built one of the ancient world's most sophisticated desert trade networks. Their merchants controlled routes stretching across Arabia, the Levant, and beyond, transporting incense, spices, textiles, and precious goods between distant civilizations. But trade alone does not explain the enormous number of ritual sites scattered throughout the desert landscape. Archaeologists have identified remote shrines, high places, sacred niches, and isolated ceremonial structures positioned far from major settlements. Some overlook caravan routes. Others stand deep within difficult terrain where only small groups could have traveled regularly. And many appear to have been abandoned abruptly. At first glance, the explanation seems straightforward. When the Roman Empire annexed the Nabataean kingdom in 106 AD, regional trade patterns gradually shifted. Economic centers changed. Long-distance caravan traffic declined in certain areas. As populations moved and religious practices evolved, remote shrines may simply have fallen out of use. Yet the archaeological evidence suggests something more complex. Several desert sanctuaries show signs of intentional closure. Ritual objects were removed carefully. Pathways ceased being maintained. In some shrines, traces of offerings stop suddenly rather than declining gradually over time. Why would sacred sites once important enough to construct in remote desert locations be abandoned so completely? The mystery deepens because the Nabataeans left relatively few written records explaining their religious beliefs directly. Much of what historians know comes from inscriptions, architecture, and references written by outsiders. Their spiritual world remains partially hidden behind symbols, sacred stones, and ritual spaces whose meanings are still debated. Certain remote shrines seem connected to celestial observation. Others align with mountain peaks, seasonal pathways, or isolated water sources essential for desert survival. In some places, altars were positioned to face specific horizons where sunrise or moonlight illuminated them during particular times of year. Were these purely religious locations, or part of something larger woven into Nabataean trade and navigation systems? The mainstream interpretation views the shrines as spiritual stations linked to caravan travel and regional pilgrimage traditions. Travelers crossing dangerous deserts may have stopped to perform rituals seeking protection, guidance, or safe passage through hostile terrain. But not every site fits neatly into that explanation. Some shrines are located in areas difficult to access, even with modern routes. Others appear unusually isolated from known trade corridors entirely. Archaeologists have found ceremonial features suggesting gatherings occurred there despite the absence of nearby settlements. Who traveled to these places, and why? A number of speculative theories have emerged over time. Some researchers wonder whether certain desert shrines served restricted ritual purposes known only to priestly groups or elite merchant families. Others propose they may have functioned as markers within hidden trade systems designed to protect valuable caravan routes from outsiders. There are also more mysterious interpretations. Local traditions in parts of the Arabian desert speak of sacred places abandoned after unexplained events, changing beliefs or warnings associated with the landscape itself. While such stories are impossible to verify historically, they reflect how isolated these sites can feel even today. In several shrines, archaeologists discovered evidence that sacred stones or statues were removed intentionally before abandonment. Were they relocated to safer locations during political change? Hidden from invaders? Or carried away as part of rituals marking the end of an older religious tradition? No one knows for certain. And perhaps that uncertainty is intensified by the desert itself. The Nabataeans mastered one of the harshest environments on Earth through engineering, water management, and intimate knowledge of the landscape. They built reservoirs, channels, and caravan stations in places where survival seemed nearly impossible. Yet many of their remote sacred sites now stand in complete isolation, exposed only to wind and silence. Walking among the ruins of these shrines today, it becomes difficult not to sense the distance between the modern world and the people who once crossed these deserts carrying incense, prayers, and offerings beneath the stars. The altars remain. The carvings survive. But the rituals, meanings, and reasons for their abandonment have largely disappeared. What caused the remote Nabataean shrines to fall silent? Were they abandoned simply because trade routes changed? Or did deeper social and spiritual transformations unfold across the desert kingdom as Roman influence expanded? And if unexplored sanctuaries still remain hidden among the mountains and valleys of the ancient Nabataean world, what forgotten ceremonies and beliefs might still be waiting beneath the desert stone untouched since the final travelers walked away? The abandoned Nabataean shrines scattered across the desert suggest that ancient trade routes carried far more than goods alone. Along these endless roads moved soldiers, pilgrims, spies, merchants, and entire systems of belief. To protect such routes, empires constructed watchtowers, fortresses, and defensive outposts at the edges of civilization itself. And sometimes, those fortresses vanished almost completely. Across the desert stretching between Mesopotamia, Persia, and the eastern frontiers of the ancient Mediterranean world, traces of forgotten strongholds occasionally emerge from the sand. Crumbling mud-brick walls rise faintly against barren horizons. Isolated foundations appear atop rocky ridges overlooking dry valleys once crossed by caravans and armies. From the air, faint geometric outlines reveal the remains of structures erased gradually by centuries of wind and erosion. These are believed to be remnants of the Parthian frontier forts. During the height of the Parthian Empire, between roughly the 3rd century BC and 3rd century AD, the Parthians controlled a vast territory extending across modern Iran, Iraq, and surrounding regions. Positioned between Rome in the west and powerful kingdoms in Central Asia and India to the east, the empire became one of the ancient world's great military and commercial powers. Its frontiers were immense. Protecting trade routes, water sources, and strategic desert crossings required an enormous defensive network. Fortified settlements, garrisons, and desert outposts likely stretched across vulnerable frontier zones where communication and survival depended on careful control of terrain. Yet many of these forts have disappeared so thoroughly that historians still struggle to determine how extensive the network truly was. Some sites survive only as scattered archaeological traces barely distinguishable from natural formations. Others are known from ancient texts but remain unidentified on the ground. A few appeared briefly during early expeditions before being lost again beneath shifting desert conditions. How could military structures once essential to an empire simply vanish? The mainstream explanation begins with the nature of desert architecture itself. Many Parthian forts were likely constructed using mud brick and local materials highly vulnerable to erosion once abandoned. Over centuries, wind, sandstorms, earthquakes, and changing climates gradually reduced walls to low mounds almost invisible from ground level. Political instability also played a role. The Parthian Empire faced repeated wars against Rome and internal dynastic struggles. Frontier systems may have shifted constantly as territories changed hands and trade routes evolved. But the mystery deepens because evidence suggests the forts were not abandoned uniformly. Some outposts appear to have been evacuated suddenly. Others show signs of rebuilding before final disappearance. At certain sites, archaeologists discovered traces of occupation continuing long after nearby settlements collapsed. Why were some forts maintained while others vanished into the desert almost without record? Part of the problem lies in the geography itself. Large sections of former Parthian frontier territory remain difficult to study due to harsh conditions, political instability, and the sheer scale of the landscape. Satellite imagery has revealed unusual rectangular formations buried beneath desert surfaces in regions rarely excavated systematically. Some researchers suspect many additional forts remain undiscovered. And there are stranger questions as well. Several ancient Roman accounts describe Parthian military mobility with near-mythical fascination. Parthian cavalry units appeared suddenly across enormous distances, using desert routes unfamiliar to invading armies. Some historians believe hidden supply stations and fortified desert corridors may have supported this mobility far more extensively than surviving archaeology currently demonstrates. If true, entire logistical networks could still remain buried beneath the sands. A number of speculative theories have emerged around that possibility. Some researchers wonder whether certain forts doubled as intelligence or communication centers connected through signal systems across the frontier. Others suggest remote outposts may have protected more than trade alone, perhaps guarding access to water systems, sacred sites, or politically sensitive caravan routes invisible in surviving written sources. There are even local traditions describing lost walls and buried fortresses appearing temporarily after storms before vanishing beneath sand again. While such stories remain difficult to verify, desert archaeology has repeatedly shown how entire settlements can disappear and reappear depending on erosion and shifting terrain. And perhaps that is what makes the mystery so compelling. Unlike monumental cities preserved in stone, the Parthian frontier existed in motion, constantly adapting to war, trade, migration, and survival across hostile landscapes. The forts were never isolated monuments. They formed part of a living border system stretching through regions where distance itself became a weapon. Today, many of those landscapes are silent. The roads have faded. The watchfires are gone. Wind moves across empty plains where soldiers once scanned the horizon for approaching caravans or enemy riders emerging from the desert. Somewhere beneath those sands may still lie collapsed barracks, sealed storage rooms, forgotten inscriptions, or military archives capable of revealing how the Parthians defended one of the ancient world's largest empires. But for now, the vanished desert forts remain suspended between history and erosion, fragments of a frontier slowly swallowed by the same deserts it was built to control. And the deeper archaeologists search into those empty regions, the more unsettling the possibility becomes that entire sections of the Parthian defensive world may still survive hidden beneath the sands, waiting silently for the desert to reveal them once again. The vanished forts of the Parthian frontier reveal how entire defensive networks can disappear beneath time and desert, leaving behind only fragments of stone and unanswered questions. But sometimes, what vanishes is not a fortress or a city. It is something considered sacred beyond measure. Objects guarded for centuries, relics believed to hold divine power, treasures hidden during moments of chaos and never seen again. Few ancient sanctuaries inspire that kind of mystery more than the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. Long before its destruction, the temple was regarded as one of the wonders of the ancient world. Rising above the city in gleaming marble, surrounded by towering columns and elaborate sculptures, it drew pilgrims, merchants, rulers, and travelers from across the Mediterranean. Dedicated to Artemis, goddess of the hunt, fertility, and protection, the sanctuary became not only a religious center, but also a place of wealth, diplomacy, and political influence. By the Roman period, the temple's sacred treasury had accumulated generations of offerings. Statues, ceremonial objects, gold, silver, precious stones, and religious relics were said to fill its chambers. Wealthy patrons donated gifts seeking divine favor. Kings and officials dedicated offerings to secure prestige and legitimacy. Ancient sanctuaries often functioned almost like protected financial institutions, trusted because violating sacred space carried both political and spiritual consequences. Then came the crisis of the 3rd century AD. Across the Roman Empire, instability spread rapidly. Civil wars erupted. Trade weakened. Frontier invasions intensified. Emperors rose and fell in quick succession. Entire provinces experienced economic collapse and military unrest. Historians now refer to this era simply as the crisis of the 3rd century, a period when the empire itself seemed dangerously close to fragmentation. And during this chaos, the Temple of Artemis suffered devastating destruction. Ancient accounts describe attacks associated with Gothic invasions sweeping through parts of Anatolia around 262 AD. Ephesus was struck. Fires spread. The temple complex endured severe damage from which it never fully recovered. But amid the destruction, something else disappeared. Many of the temple's most sacred relics and treasures were never clearly accounted for afterward. At first glance, the explanation appears obvious. Invaders looted the sanctuary. Priceless objects were stolen, melted down, traded, or scattered across the collapsing networks of the Roman world. Similar losses occurred at temples and cities throughout antiquity. Yet the deeper historians examine the surviving evidence, the more uncertain the story becomes. Because while the destruction of the temple is well attested, detailed records of what happened to its treasury are strangely incomplete. Certain relics referenced by earlier writers vanish entirely from the historical record after the 3rd century. Inventories that might have clarified the losses no longer survive. And perhaps most intriguingly, some ancient traditions suggest not all sacred objects were present when the temple fell. Could valuables have been removed beforehand? The Temple of Artemis was not merely a religious building, it was one of the wealthiest sanctuaries in the Mediterranean world. Priests, civic authorities, and elite families connected to Ephesus would have understood the danger posed by growing instability long before the final attacks occurred. Some historians believe portions of the treasury may have been evacuated quietly during the empire's escalating crisis. Sacred statues, ceremonial objects, or archives could have been hidden within nearby estates, underground chambers, or secondary sanctuaries beyond the city itself. But if that happened, where were they taken? Several speculative theories have emerged over the centuries. Some researchers focus on underground structures beneath ancient Ephesus, including storage vaults, tunnels, and sealed foundations that remain only partially excavated. Others suggest sacred relics associated with Artemis may have been transported secretly through maritime trade routes before the city's destruction intensified. There are also persistent legends describing hidden caches protected by temple attendants, attempting to preserve the goddess's sacred possessions from invaders. No definitive evidence confirms such stories, yet fragments of the mystery continue to surface unexpectedly. Isolated artifacts connected stylistically to the Ephesian sanctuary have appeared in distant collections without clear provenance. Ancient references hint at ceremonial objects later rumored to survive elsewhere in the eastern Mediterranean long after the temple's decline. And then there is the strange silence surrounding the cult statue itself. The central image of Artemis at Ephesus was among the most famous sacred objects of the ancient world. Ancient descriptions portray a figure unlike the Greek Artemis worshipped elsewhere, an older, distinctly Anatolian form of the goddess deeply connected to local tradition. What became of that statue after the destruction? Was it destroyed in the fires? Stolen during the invasions? Hidden deliberately by priests hoping one day to restore the sanctuary? No one can say with certainty. Standing among the ruins of the Temple of Artemis today, little remains of its former grandeur beyond scattered stones and reconstructed columns rising against the sky. Yet beneath the silence lingers the possibility that not everything was lost in the chaos of the 3rd century. Somewhere, perhaps beneath ruins, forgotten vaults, or buried coastal settlements, traces of the temple's vanished relics may still survive. Objects once considered sacred enough to protect at any cost as the Roman world around them began to fracture. And if even a small portion of those missing treasures was hidden successfully before the destruction, the final secrets of the Temple of Artemis may still remain waiting somewhere beyond the reach of recorded history. The missing relics of the Temple of Artemis remind us that sacred objects often vanished during periods of chaos, leaving behind only rumors, fragments, and unanswered questions. But sometimes the mystery is not about what disappeared. Sometimes it is about structures that remain standing in silence, monuments so large and deliberate that they clearly mattered deeply to the people who built them, even if their true purpose has long been forgotten. Across the windswept grasslands, stretching north of the Black Sea and deep into the Eurasian steppe, strange stone circles rise unexpectedly from the landscape. Some are barely visible beneath tall grass and layers of earth. Others remain sharply defined, enormous rings of stone arranged across open plains far from major settlements or recognizable ceremonial centers. For centuries, many passed unnoticed. Yet archaeologists working near ancient Sarmatian territories have increasingly encountered these enigmatic formations, massive circular arrangements positioned near burial mounds, trade routes, and the remains of nomadic encampments once occupied by one of the most powerful steppe cultures of antiquity. The Sarmatians were Iranian-speaking nomadic peoples who dominated large portions of the Eurasian steppe between roughly the 5th century BC and the 4th century AD. Expert horsemen and formidable warriors, they moved across immense distances, interacting with Scythians, Persians, Greeks, and eventually the expanding Roman world. Much of what is known about them comes from burial sites, weapons, jewelry, and the writings of neighboring civilizations. But the stone circles remain among the least understood traces connected to their world. At first glance, the formations appear deceptively simple: rings of carefully positioned stones, sometimes surrounding central features or shallow depressions. Certain circles span surprisingly large distances, requiring significant labor and coordination to construct, despite the highly mobile nature traditionally associated with steppe cultures. Why build permanent monuments in landscapes defined by movement? The mainstream explanation focuses on ritual and funerary practices. Stone circles across Eurasia are often associated with burials, ancestor worship, territorial markers, or ceremonial gatherings tied to seasonal migration patterns. Some archaeologists believe the Sarmatian circles marked sacred spaces connected to elite clans or warrior traditions, and in several cases, nearby burial mounds support that interpretation. Yet many details remain uncertain. Some circles contain no obvious graves at all. Others are positioned with unusual precision relative to nearby hills, rivers, or celestial alignments. A few appear isolated from any major settlement or burial complex entirely. Why construct such massive formations in seemingly empty landscapes? The mystery deepens because the Sarmatians themselves left almost no written records explaining their beliefs directly. Their spiritual traditions survive only indirectly through archaeology and accounts written by outsiders, many of whom understood little about steppe ritual life. As a result, interpretations vary widely. Some researchers argue the circles functioned as gathering sites where tribal alliances, ceremonies, and seasonal councils took place beneath the open sky. Others suggest they may have served astronomical purposes, helping track seasonal cycles critical for migration, warfare, and survival across the steppe. Certain alignments observed at a handful of sites have fueled those theories further. But not all scholars agree such alignments were intentional. Then there are the more speculative possibilities. A number of fringe researchers believe the circles represent remnants of far older traditions, inherited from prehistoric cultures long predating the Sarmatians themselves. Because the Eurasian steppe contains layers of occupation stretching back thousands of years, some sites may have been reused repeatedly by different peoples over vast spans of time. Others focus on the unusual scale of certain circles. Constructing massive stone rings in remote grasslands would have required labor difficult to reconcile with the image of constantly mobile nomadic groups. Did the Sarmatians become more settled in certain regions than historians once believed? Or were the circles connected to larger ceremonial networks extending across the steppe? There are even theories suggesting some formations functioned as symbolic maps or ritual spaces tied to cosmological beliefs now completely lost. No definitive evidence confirms such ideas. Yet the circles continue to resist easy explanation, and perhaps part of their mystery comes from the landscapes surrounding them. The Eurasian steppe possesses a strange sense of openness and isolation. Under vast skies, distances become difficult to judge. Wind moves endlessly across grasslands where ancient riders once traveled between horizons. In such environments, monuments built from stone acquire unusual psychological weight, as though they were designed to anchor memory itself against the endless movement of the plains. Standing inside one of the circles today, silence dominates everything. No inscriptions explain who built the site. No surviving texts describe the ceremonies once held there. Only the stones remain, arranged deliberately by people whose world has almost entirely vanished. Were these circles sacred gathering places, burial markers, astronomical observatories, or symbols of territorial power? Did they belong exclusively to the Sarmatians, or preserve fragments of even older traditions absorbed into steppe culture over generations? And if more undiscovered circles still lie hidden beneath grasslands and buried soil across the Eurasian frontier, what forgotten beliefs or rituals might they reveal about civilizations that once moved across the steppe beneath the same endless sky? For now, the giant stone circles near the ancient Sarmatian settlements remain suspended between archaeology and silence. Enigmatic monuments whose true purpose may still be waiting somewhere beyond the edges of recorded history. The mysterious stone circles near ancient Sarmatian territories remind us that entire cultures can leave behind monuments without leaving behind explanations. Across the ancient world, people built structures, mapped landscapes, and created systems of trade so vast that fragments of them still survive long after the civilizations themselves faded into silence. But sometimes, what disappears is not stone or architecture. Sometimes, it is the record of movement itself. At the northern edge of the Persian Gulf, where muddy river deltas once opened into some of the busiest maritime trade routes of the ancient world, the kingdom of Karanisin emerged as a powerful crossroads between empires. Ships arriving from Arabia, India, Mesopotamia, and beyond passed through its ports carrying spices, pearls, textiles, incense, ivory, and precious metals across enormous commercial networks linking east and west. Today, much of that world lies buried beneath shifting waterways, marshland, and desert sediment. Ancient harbors have vanished. Coastlines have changed. Entire settlements once positioned beside the sea now sit far inland due to centuries of river movement and silting. And within that lost maritime landscape lies one of the lesser-known mysteries of the ancient Near East, the disappearance of the fleet records of Karanisin. Founded sometime in the late 4th century BC, near the head of the Persian Gulf, Karanisin occupied a strategically critical position between the Parthian Empire and the maritime trade systems of the Indian Ocean. Its capital, Charax-Spasinu, became a wealthy commercial center where merchants from distant regions exchanged goods and information. The kingdom survived for centuries largely because of its control over trade, and trade on that scale required administration. Ports collect records, ships leave manifests, taxes generate archives, cargoes are tracked, naval patrols and merchant fleets require coordination. Ancient writers occasionally described the remarkable commercial activity flowing through the region, suggesting that Karanisin maintained an organized maritime system far more sophisticated than surviving evidence fully reveals. Yet almost none of its fleet records survive. That absence has puzzled historians for decades. Compared to other ancient trade powers, remarkably little documentation remains describing the kingdom's naval infrastructure, ship registries, commercial routes, or harbor administration. Archaeological evidence confirms Karanisin's importance within Indian Ocean trade networks, but the written administrative material expected from such a maritime state appears strangely limited. Where did the records go? The mainstream explanation points first toward geography and preservation. The humid environment of the Gulf region is notoriously destructive to organic materials such as papyrus, parchment, and wood. Flooding, river shifts, salt exposure, and repeated rebuilding likely destroyed enormous quantities of documentation naturally over time. Political instability may have accelerated those losses. Karanisin existed between competing empires for centuries, balancing relationships with Parthians, local rulers, and expanding regional powers. Wars, invasions, and economic disruption could easily have scattered or destroyed archives. But certain aspects of the disappearance remain unusual. Ancient references imply extensive maritime administration, yet surviving records are fragmented almost beyond expectation for a kingdom so commercially active. Even indirect references to fleet organization are surprisingly scarce. Some historians wonder whether major archives remain undiscovered beneath buried sections of ancient port settlements now lost under sediment and changing river channels. Others suspect part of the maritime network may have operated through decentralized merchant systems that intentionally limited centralized documentation. And then there are the more speculative theories. A number of researchers have proposed that Karanisin's strategic position made secrecy economically valuable. Trade flowing between Rome, Persia, Arabia, and India involved immense wealth. Shipping routes, harbor taxes, and commercial agreements would have represented sensitive information capable of shifting regional power balances. Could some records have been deliberately concealed or destroyed during periods of political turmoil? There are also intriguing references in later traditions describing hidden warehouses, sealed harbor vaults, and lost river ports swallowed gradually by the changing waters of the Gulf region. While difficult to verify historically, such stories align with the extraordinary environmental transformation the region experienced over centuries. Entire coastlines moved. Cities vanished beneath mud and marsh, and somewhere within those lost landscapes may still lie traces of the kingdom's forgotten maritime archives. The mystery deepens because Karanisin existed at the meeting point of worlds. Greek influence blended with Mesopotamian traditions, Arabian trade systems, and Persian political structures. Ships sailing from its ports connected civilizations separated by thousands of miles long before modern navigation existed. Yet despite that immense importance, the kingdom itself feels strangely obscured, as though one of antiquity's great commercial crossroads faded quietly from historical memory, while larger empires drew attention elsewhere. Standing today near the former waterways of the ancient Gulf, it becomes difficult to imagine the scale of movement that once defined the region. Fleets of merchant vessels navigating shallow channels, harbor officials recording cargoes arriving from distant seas, sailors carrying languages, beliefs, and stories between continents. All of it depended on records, and most of those records disappeared. Were the fleet archives destroyed naturally through time and environmental collapse? Hidden during wars and never recovered? Or do undiscovered repositories still survive beneath buried harbor districts and forgotten river ports waiting beneath layers of sediment at the edge of the ancient sea? For now, the missing maritime records of Karanisin remain suspended between archaeology, trade history, and silence. A reminder that some of the ancient world's greatest networks may have vanished not through catastrophe alone, but through the slow disappearance of the documents that once explained how entire civilizations moved across the water. The missing fleet records of Karanisin reveal how entire systems of trade and industry can disappear when archives are lost and landscapes transform beyond recognition. But commerce in the ancient world did not rely only on ships and ports. Beneath mountains and forests, deep underground in darkness lit by oil lamps and fire, another source of imperial power once flowed steadily toward Rome. Silver. For centuries, Roman silver fueled economies, paid armies, minted coins, and sustained political authority across the empire. And among the regions believed to contain some of the empire's most productive mining operations was Dalmatia, a rugged territory stretching along the eastern Adriatic coast, marked by steep mountains, dense forests, and labyrinthine valleys. Today, parts of that ancient mining world seem to have vanished almost entirely. Scattered across remote hillsides and hidden deep within Balkan terrain are traces of tunnels, collapsed shafts, ruined smelting sites, and fragments of Roman infrastructure slowly reclaimed by vegetation and stone. Some openings descend abruptly into darkness before ending in flooded passages or cave-ins. Others appear only as unnatural cuts in rock barely distinguishable from the surrounding landscape. These are believed to be remnants of the lost Roman silver mines of Dalmatia. Ancient Roman writers occasionally reference the mineral wealth of the Balkans, and archaeological discoveries confirm that mining activity existed throughout the region during imperial rule. Silver extraction became critically important for Rome, especially during periods of economic expansion and military campaigning. Yet, despite that importance, the precise locations and full extent of many Dalmatian silver operations remain strangely uncertain. Some mines appear in scattered records before disappearing completely from later documentation. Others are suspected based on slag deposits and abandoned settlements, but have never been fully identified or excavated. How could industrial sites vital to one of history's largest empires simply vanish? The mainstream explanation begins with geography and time. Dalmatia's mountainous terrain is notoriously difficult to navigate, and centuries of earthquakes, erosion, warfare, and vegetation growth altered the landscape dramatically. Many Roman mining sites were likely abandoned gradually as ore deposits declined or political conditions changed. After the collapse of Roman authority in the region, infrastructure decayed. Roads disappeared. Forests reclaimed old transport routes. Local populations shifted during invasions and migrations that reshaped the Balkans repeatedly over centuries. But certain details remain difficult to explain fully. Some Roman administrative records suggest mining activity continued longer than surviving archaeological evidence currently confirms. References to imperial oversight, taxation, and metal transport imply an organized extraction network larger than the number of identified sites would suggest. Where were all these mines? The mystery deepens because silver was not merely an economic resource. Control over precious metals carried immense political importance. During periods of instability, mining regions became strategic assets worth protecting and concealing. Several historians believe some Dalmatian mines may have been deliberately hidden or sealed during times of invasion and unrest. There is precedent for such actions in antiquity. Mines could be collapsed intentionally to prevent enemy access. Administrative records might be destroyed during civil wars or imperial transitions. Workers familiar with remote extraction sites may have fled or died during periods of regional violence, leaving locations gradually forgotten. And Dalmatia experienced centuries of upheaval. Roman civil conflicts, barbarian incursions, shifting frontiers, and later medieval wars transformed the region repeatedly. Entire settlements vanished from historical memory. In mountainous areas, isolated industrial sites could disappear surprisingly quickly once abandoned. But there are more mysterious possibilities as well. Some researchers suspect undiscovered mining complexes still exist deep within remote Balkan terrain. Modern surveys have identified unusual underground cavities and artificial-looking formations in areas rarely explored systematically. In certain valleys, local legends describe Roman tunnels, extending far beneath mountainsides before collapsing or flooding. Others point toward strange gaps in Roman economic history itself. At times, silver production appears to fluctuate in ways historians struggle to explain completely through known mining centers alone. Could hidden Dalmatian operations have supplied larger portions of the empire's silver than surviving records indicate? There are even stories of sealed chambers within abandoned mines where tools, ore, and equipment were allegedly left behind suddenly, as though workers departed without returning. No definitive evidence confirms such tales. Yet the atmosphere surrounding these lost mining regions continues to provoke fascination. Because unlike temples or palaces, mines represent the hidden machinery of empire. Deep underground, far from Rome's marble monuments, laborers extracted the metals that sustained armies, trade, and political power itself. Entire economies depended on places most citizens would never see. Standing near the entrances of abandoned Roman shafts today, the silence feels unusually heavy. Cold air rises from darkness untouched for centuries. Water drips through collapsed tunnels where miners once worked beneath torchlight and choking dust. Somewhere deeper inside the mountains may still lie forgotten tools, buried ore veins, or even sealed passages connected to operations no surviving map records anymore. Why did so many Dalmatian silver mines disappear from history so completely? Were they exhausted naturally, destroyed during conflict, or intentionally concealed during the empire's long decline? And if unexplored tunnels still survive beneath the forests and mountains of the Balkans, what forgotten traces of Rome's hidden industrial world might still remain waiting in the darkness below? For now, the Roman silver mines of Dalmatia remain suspended between archaeology, legend, and shadow, lost sources of imperial wealth slowly disappearing beneath the mountains that once concealed them. The lost silver mines of Dalmatia remind us that entire industries can vanish into mountains, leaving behind only fragments of tunnels, scattered records, and rumors buried beneath centuries of silence. Yet sometimes, the mystery is not hidden underground. Sometimes it survives in plain sight, etched carefully into metal by hands long gone, waiting for someone to understand what was written. In the dry hills and river valleys of southern Spain, archaeologists have uncovered a series of ancient bronze plaques, unlike almost anything else in the Western Mediterranean world. Tarnished green by age and corrosion, the plaques are often small enough to hold in two hands, yet their surfaces contain rows of intricate symbols carved with astonishing precision. The inscriptions are unmistakably deliberate. Lines of strange characters stretch across the bronze in patterns that resemble language, law, ritual, or perhaps something even more complex. Some plaques appear fragmented, broken long ago before burial. Others remain almost intact, preserving scripts that scholars can partially identify but still cannot fully understand. These are the untranslated Iberian bronze plaques. Created by the Iberian peoples who inhabited large portions of the Iberian Peninsula before and during the expansion of Roman influence, the plaques belong to one of Europe's oldest unresolved linguistic mysteries. The Iberians maintained thriving settlements, trade networks, and sophisticated artistic traditions for centuries before Roman domination transformed the region. And yet, despite decades of study, much of their written language remains undeciphered. Researchers can recognize many of the symbols and even pronounce portions of the script phonetically. But understanding the meaning behind the words remains extraordinarily difficult. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs, there is no true Iberian equivalent to the Rosetta Stone, a bilingual inscription capable of unlocking the language fully. So the plaques continue to resist translation. At first glance, the mystery appears purely linguistic. Ancient languages disappear frequently when civilizations collapse or are absorbed into larger empires. Without surviving dictionaries, parallel texts, or continuous literary traditions, decipherment becomes incredibly challenging. But the bronze plaques raise deeper questions. Because some inscriptions appear highly formalized, suggesting they carried major importance within Iberian society. Certain plaques contain repeated formulas, symbols, or structures that resemble legal decrees, sacred dedications, trade agreements, or ritual texts. What exactly did they record? The mainstream interpretation proposes several possibilities. Some plaques may preserve commercial transactions tied to mining and Mediterranean trade. Others could represent religious offerings deposited in sanctuaries or burial sites. A few scholars suspect certain inscriptions reflect political treaties between local communities during periods of conflict and alliance. Yet no single explanation fits all known examples. Some plaques contain symbols and arrangements found nowhere else in surviving Iberian inscriptions. Others were discovered in unusual contexts far from major settlements, suggesting they may have served ceremonial or specialized functions rather than ordinary administrative use. The mystery deepens because southern Spain during antiquity was a crossroads of civilizations. Phoenicians, Greeks, Carthaginians, and Romans all interacted with Iberian populations through trade, warfare, and cultural exchange. Coastal cities became melting pots of language and belief systems layered across generations. As a result, the plaques may preserve traces of multiple influences woven together into scripts modern researchers still struggle to separate fully. And then there are the more speculative theories. A number of fringe researchers believe some plaques encode astronomical observations, sacred formulas, or esoteric knowledge intended only for elite priestly groups. Others point toward repeated geometric patterns embedded within certain inscriptions, arguing they may contain symbolic meanings beyond ordinary language. There are even theories suggesting parts of the Iberian script preserve remnants of far older Mediterranean traditions now completely lost. Most mainstream linguists remain cautious about such claims, emphasizing that incomplete translation naturally invites speculation. Still, the inability to understand the plaques fully has allowed mystery to grow around them for generations, and perhaps part of that mystery lies in the material itself. Bronze was valuable. Creating inscribed plaques required resources, craftsmanship, and intention. These were not casual writings scratched onto pottery fragments. Someone wanted these messages preserved. Yet preserved for whom? Standing before one of the plaques in a museum today can feel strangely unsettling. The symbols appear close enough to language to seem readable, yet distant enough to remain inaccessible. Human thoughts survive there, frozen in metal across more than 2,000 years, but their meanings remain just beyond reach. A legal warning, a prayer, a treaty, a map, a sacred ritual no longer remembered. Some inscriptions may eventually yield more of their secrets through advances in linguistic analysis and archaeology. New discoveries could provide missing context capable of connecting fragments scholars have struggled with for decades. Or perhaps the key to understanding the plaques still lies buried somewhere beneath the soil of southern Spain, inside an undiscovered archive, sanctuary, or settlement waiting silently beneath olive groves and ancient hills. Until then, the untranslated Iberian bronze plaques remain suspended between language and silence, preserving voices from a vanished civilization that can still be heard, but not yet understood. And the longer the inscriptions resist translation, the more haunting the question becomes. What knowledge, beliefs, or warnings have been waiting patiently on those bronze surfaces for over 2,000 years, hidden in plain sight from the modern world?